Our story begins with a massive dark power gathering to end the world. The hero even apologized to everyone for being too weak and reflected that Chris, our protagonist, should have been the hero instead of him. The heroic lady begged Evan not to say such things, reminding them all that they had done their best, though she was frustrated that it was all they could manage. She then remarked that if Chris, the genius, had only started learning swordsmanship a little earlier, he could have surpassed the 9-star level and become a 10-star hero. Had that happened, Chris and Evan might have been able to stop the end. The Great Extra was the nickname given to Chris due to his incredible talent that allowed him to master anything instantly, enabling him to leave behind a grand legacy of achievements. The journey of this Great Extra began one day when he was 20 years old, back when Chris had escaped from his cursed clan and dreamed of success while working in back alleys. There, he noticed a quest on the board, an invasion by the Demon King of Carnage, labeled the Age of Destruction mission. It was recruiting a party to travel with the hero. He applied for it, knowing it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and swore to achieve greatness so that when the war ended, he could enjoy wealth and honor to his heart's content. Unfortunately for him, they failed in the end. The Dominion of Light ultimately fell into the hands of the Demon King of Carnage. When he heard hero Evan wishing he could turn back time to be selected as the hero, Chris thought to himself that even if he could go back, he had no intention of doing it all again. One life of suffering was enough, and there was no point in dreaming about it anymore. Not now, with the world on the brink of collapse. The dark magical power was nearly complete, and everyone could see it was about to erupt. Chris realized it was truly the end and, in his final thoughts, wished that in his next life, if such a thing existed, he would be born the son of a wealthy family. He closed his eyes, accepting the fate of all humankind. But then, when he opened his eyes, he realized he had regressed. He was now in the body of a young master of the Magic Empire. Chris found himself in the Dark Magic Clan, one of the 12 clans that supported the Magic Empire. From what he could gather, he had regressed 15 years into the past, returning to 5 years before the start of the Age of Destruction. He believed he had seen it all in his past life, but he never expected to witness demon beasts tending a garden. On top of that, he soon discovered whose body he had regressed into, Christian Van Baron Kazar. He recalled asking a friend if Christian was a fiend from a branch family, and his friend confirmed it. She explained that the House of Count Kazar was a branch of the Baron County, or the Dark Magic Clan. He asked if it was a relatively weaker clan, but she replied no. While it was a branch family, it held good standing within the Dark Magic Clan, and not to mention how wealthy they were. She doubted there was a single fiend in the Magic Empire who didn't know of them. His friend added that she had heard they had 2 potential successors, but of the elder son, Christian was known as a true bastard, a constant troublemaker. Count Kazar had eventually given up on him. However, it was all old news. Chris asked why it was considered old news, and whether Christian had straightened out. His friend replied that Christian had been murdered by his relatives. Chris broke into a cold sweat at the memory. He slammed his hand against the mirror in frustration. All he had wanted was to be born into a regular rich family, but instead, he had regressed into that life. He cried out in dismay. Why here? Why Christian? Why the bastard who was destined to die? He didn't know what he should do and forced his brain to come up with a solution. He then realized that he had awakened in this body, one with a coincidentally similar name to his own, just 3 days ago, and that Christian would die in 2 years. The fact that Christian had been eliminated within the House of Count Kazar, a family that placed great importance on honor, likely meant that Christian was an absolute good for nothing. So, he figured that if he simply stayed quiet and well-behaved, he might be able to avoid that fate. He then thought that since he had woken up as a rich kid, he should just take care of himself and enjoy the wealth and honor. But then he slapped his forehead hard, realizing that such a life wasn't going to happen. Ragnarok, the end of the world, and the reason the Demon King of Carnage had started the war, was to offer humanity as a sacrifice to complete it. He remembered that by the time they discovered this, it was already too late. Both the Dominion of Light and the Magic Empire had met their ultimate demise. That meant if he wanted to survive, he needed to stop the apocalypse. He knew that the Demon King of Carnage was the one who had initiated the war, but the bigger problem was the countless fiends in the Magic Empire who were loyal to him. To stop it all, Chris believed he had to become someone even more powerful than the Demon King of Carnage. He knew there was only one way to do that. He needed to become the Demon Emperor and reach the pinnacle of the Magic Empire. He realized he had been given 5 years before the Age of Destruction would begin, and decided to give it a try. If he succeeded, that mansion, and the entire Magic Empire, would be his. A moment later, Count Kazar slammed his hand on the table in anger and shouted that he was certain he had told him to remain in his room. Count Kazar then asked him if he had no shame in showing his face there after causing that incident not long ago. He warned him that if he acted out of line one more time, he would personally cut off his head. He remained silent, realizing that Count Kazar had an incredibly intimidating aura. But then Count Kazar was caught off guard when Chris calmly explained that he had come to apologize for all the wrongdoings he had committed up until now. Chris knew that if he wanted to move forward with his plan, he had to shed the good-for-nothing image Christian had built up. Count Kazar asked him what he had just said, and Chris replied that he was truly sorry for everything he had done, and promised that it would never happen again. Yet, Count Kazar asked if he expected him to believe such words mere days after his last disgrace, and whether he intended to mock him. He looked away, wondering what the most recent mess Christian had gotten into before his regression had been. He had heard so many stories that he couldn't even pick one out. Still, he admitted that part of the reason Count Kazar had lost faith in him was his own fault. He explained that 3 days ago, he had lost a portion of his memories, and in trying to recover them, he had reflected on his past actions and realized how misguided his life had been. He once more apologized with all his heart. However, Count Kazar was not about to back down and reminded him that he had heard excuses like that countless times before. Chris agreed that words alone meant nothing and assured Count Kazar that he would prove himself through his actions going forward. He then begged Count Khazar to send him to the punishment cave and swore to stay there for a month, determined to show him a different side of himself. The punishment cave, a prison used for high-status fiends, was a place devoid of light, where all 5 human senses were blocked. Even a few days inside were enough to drain one's mind. However, it was the perfect place for Chris at the moment, as he needed somewhere to escape the gazes of others. Count Khazar asked him if he truly wanted to confine himself in the punishment cave for a whole month, adding that he doubted Chris could last even half a day. But Chris responded with confidence, stating that he was fully aware of how difficult a place it was. Still, he believed it was the bare minimum required to earn Count Khazar's trust. Count Khazar stared at him in silence for a moment before asking if he realized how many times they had already had this conversation. He reminded Chris that every time, he had only ended up disappointed once again, leaving Chris speechless. Fortunately for him, Count Khazar agreed and said he would play along, offering him one final chance. But he warned that if nothing changed after a full month, he would banish him from the clan. Chris clenched his hand tightly, knowing that would essentially be a death sentence. There were countless people who would aim for Christian's life once he lost the clan's protection. Even so, he responded that he understood, and then asked Count Khazar if he could prove he had changed to grant him one request. This angered Count Khazar, who told him he sounded arrogant, like he was certain he'd come out unscathed. Yet he agreed, swearing that if Chris could show he had turned over a new leaf, he would grant him any request. Count Khazar then walked away, correcting him with a cold remark. It didn't mean he believed it would ever happen. A moment later, Chris was in his room, staring intently at something on the table when Cox, the butler of House Khazar and a half-vampire, entered to report that the punishment cave had been prepared. Chris placed the object down on the table and replied that he understood. He followed Cox through the hallway, while the servants whispered among themselves that the good-for-nothing had volunteered to enter the punishment cave. They speculated about what kind of scheme he might be plotting this time. Chris overheard them mention the recent incident where he had insulted the young lady of the Poison Magic clan, an incident Count Khazar had to personally apologize for. They whispered that it had been humiliating to save face before a rival clan, and they wondered when he, a known good-for-nothing, would finally mature. Some even began placing bets on how long he would last in the punishment cave. When Chris heard the highest bet was 2 days, he smirked and continued walking silently, unaware that someone was watching him. Eventually they arrived at the punishment cave. 2 massive fiendish guards were stationed at the entrance. Chris looked at them and thought that using Death Knights as guards was quite fitting for the Magic Empire. He began walking toward the cave door, unconcerned with the guards, as long as they could keep others from entering the cave. But suddenly, someone called out, "Big brother!" He turned in confusion and saw a familiar face. Then he realized it was Christian's biological younger brother, the model student, Thurn van Baron Khazar. Thurn then drew his sword and aimed it at him, which shocked Chris, though he remained calm and simply stared into Thurn's eyes. It scared the hell out of him, but he couldn't show it. He calmly asked Thurn what business he had with him, since it didn't seem like he was there to wish him farewell. Thurn told him that he was well aware that Chris was a disgrace to the family, and although he didn't know what kind of trouble Chris was planning now, he warned him that if he sullied the family's honor again, he would personally kill him. Thurn then asked if he understood and informed him that this was his final warning, making Chris realize that it must have been Thurn who Christian had died to. He remembered having met Thurn personally during the Age of Destruction, where Thurn was a fiend famous for curse magic. Chris sighed, thinking that Thurn had been cute as a child and had trained diligently. However, now he was just a brat in front of someone like him. Someone who had faced the horrors of the Age of Destruction. Chris calmly pushed Thurn's sword aside and told him to move it. Thurn was startled by his reaction and asked what he had just said, but Chris simply replied that he understood the warning and ordered him to be on his way. Thurn insisted he was serious and started to warn him again, but Chris turned away and entered the punishment cave, leaving Thurn stunned and speechless. Thurn then stuttered, raising his voice to ask what was with that attitude. Inside the punishment cave, Chris walked deeper and noticed that he could no longer see or hear anything. Only the faintest sensation remained at his fingertips. He guessed that was intentional, so prisoners could still feel the objects they brought in. Otherwise, they might starve to death. He knew that an ordinary person would quickly become mentally drained in such a place. However, that was irrelevant to him. He had experienced worse during his days as a treasure hunter, and the isolation of the 5 senses was exactly what he wanted. It would allow him to look deeper within himself. Without his 5 senses, Chris couldn't overhaul his currently broken body. It would take a lot of time and luck, but with the medical skills he had suffered to master as the Divine Doctor, the bone compression art he had modified from the body modification techniques he learned in the circus, and the magic stones of various properties, it was certainly possible. He picked up one of the magic stones with his fingers, thinking that he wouldn't have been able to get a hold of such stones, considering how expensive they were, but guessed it was one of the niceties of being in an elite clan. They had honored his requests, even though he was known as a good-for-nothing. It reminded him how, in his previous life, even he and Evan had struggled to obtain magic stones. He took out the magic stones, knowing that he had to start with the white magic stone, which would purify toxins. It was a boring process, but he understood that it was essential. It required him to meticulously cleanse any toxin buildup throughout his body using white mana. However, even the slightest mistake could cause searing pain across his entire body. He began to purge every single toxin from within, and in just seconds he was 100% purified, having completed the process without even getting hurt. For him, it was a cakewalk. On the other hand, at the same time in the Count's office, Count Khazar asked Cox how Chris was doing. Cox replied that Chris had obediently entered the punishment cave, but he was worried it might break Chris so badly that he wouldn't even be able to call for help. That made Count Khazar wonder if sending Chris into the punishment cave had been a mistake. Count Khazar recalled that Chris had such a promising future as a child. He didn't know what had caused him to fall apart so suddenly, and wondered whether his gifted nature had made him arrogant. Count Khazar thought that, whatever the reason, he'd rather see Chris completely ruined or even dead than living such a wretched life. But then, he remembered Chris's confident vow to show him through his actions. Count Khazar shook his head and reminded himself not to have any expectations. Chris had deceived them too many times before. He then asked Cox if he had noticed anything unusual when Chris entered the cave. Cox was startled by the question and hesitated to answer, which angered Count Khazar, who ordered him not to hide anything and to report every detail. Cox admitted that Chris had taken magic stones into the cave, including a dream stone, an item that induces hallucinations. He told Count Khazar that since they didn't know the side effects, they should immediately open the cave and pull Chris out. But Count Khazar firmly clenched his fist and replied no. If that was the case, he said, then they should leave Chris to die. 1 month later, Count Khazar stood in front of the punishment cave, thinking that Chris must be a wreck by now. Suddenly, the cave door opened from the inside, and Count Khazar was shocked to see Chris completely fine and clean. Chris stepped out and cheerfully told Count Khazar that he had arrived and had been waiting for him. He walked out of the cave and stopped in front of him, asking if he was surprised, and reminded Count Khazar of his promise to return as a changed man. Count Khazar became teary-eyed upon seeing the confidence in Chris's gaze, a look he hadn't seen since Chris was a child. Count Khazar admitted that Chris had successfully endured the punishment. Chris laughed and asked if that was a compliment, but Count Khazar told him not to get on his high horse over something so minor and reminded him that they still didn't trust him. Chris responded with a sigh, saying that just meant he'd have to work harder, and silently thought that Count Khazar was a rigid old man. He figured that Count Khazar believed he had barely endured the cave, but that wasn't the case. Chris had been so busy training that he hadn't had a single moment to feel bored. First, he optimized his body to master swordplay. Thanks to the White Mana Stone, every cell in his body was bursting with life. Furthermore, the Dreamstone had been a game changer. Cox had tried to stop him from bringing the narcotic Mana Stone, but in hindsight, Chris was glad he had stayed stubborn. The hallucinations had drastically reduced the time required for metamorphosis. On top of that, Chris created 2 cores, one of them being a 1-star spell, Light. He proudly thought to himself that he was a freaking genius. Needless to say, Chris used his Darkness core to conceal his Light core, knowing that the fiends would cause a massive uproar if they ever discovered it. Things ending there would have been great, but then a magic stone floated near him. When he saw that it was the Dreaming Stone, he smirked and thought to himself that it had been a mistake to give it to him. Someone had likely hoped to get Chris high off it and break him down, but Chris decided to take on that challenge and planned to use it as a stepping stone for his leap forward. He then told Count Khazar that he wished to make a request, since he had kept his promise. Count Khazar ordered him to speak, and Chris requested permission to use the Black Swamp Knight's training ground. However, Count Khazar firmly replied that a good-for-nothing like him had no place there. He reminded Chris that they were one of the 3 orders of knights supporting the Dark Magic clan, and that only the most elite knights were allowed to demonstrate their skills in that space. Chris explained that he wasn't asking to join the order, only to borrow the training ground, because he believed that watching the bravery of the Black Swamp Knights would be a positive influence on him. Count Khazar considered it for a moment and agreed, but warned him not to behave disgracefully before the knights. Chris responded that he understood. As Count Khazar was about to walk away, Chris stopped him, saying there was one more thing he wanted to request. The next day, at the Black Swamp Knights training ground, the knights were gathered when they noticed Chris approaching. They whispered among themselves, asking if that wasn't the foolish young master, and wondering why he was there. Upon hearing them, Chris realized they were blatantly bad-mouthing a Count's son. He guessed it was because they were in the Magic Empire, where strength held more weight than status. There was another reason Chris had wanted to come there. If he could get Deputy Commander Melon's letter of recommendation, Count Khazar would give him the key to the library. That library was the subject of his second request, as it housed all of House Khazar's dark magic grimoires. To learn dark magic, gaining access to that library was essential. Just a day earlier, he had asked Count Khazar why he had placed a condition on the request when Chris was still a member of the clan. Count Khazar reminded him how he had once tried to sell an advanced grimoire on the black market at a cheap price. Chris was left speechless and wondered what kind of life his body had lived before him. He confirmed to himself that Christian truly had been a lowly good-for-nothing. Back in the present, Chris walked through the training ground, fully aware that his top priority was to earn the Deputy Commander's recognition. But then, shadows appeared in his path. Looking up, he saw a group of knights blocking his way. Among them was Thurn. Thurn told him that it wasn't a place a worm like him could casually walk into. Though frustrated to see Thurn again, Chris smirked as an idea came to him. He figured this might be a good opportunity. Thurn then warned him to go back, approaching him while saying that he was sure Chris didn't want to throw away the life he had so narrowly saved in the punishment cave. Chris sighed and asked Thurn if he could truly stand by those words when it was their father who had permitted him to enter the training grounds. Thurn was shocked upon hearing it and couldn't believe it. Suddenly, someone approached from behind, saying she respected the Count's decision, but that he was not very trustworthy. When Chris turned around, he saw it was Deputy Commander Melon. He also noticed that she was releasing a dark aura, at least 4-star in strength, leading him to guess they intended to scare him off from the start, unaware that he was already used to threats like this. He respectfully greeted Melon, which surprised her. She couldn't believe he had withstood her dark energy. He then told them that since the Deputy Commander was stepping in as well, there was no helping it. He would prove he was qualified to use the training ground. Melon asked how he intended to do that, perhaps by fighting one of the fiends present and winning. She warned him that his joke had gone too far. Yet Chris calmly responded that he wasn't joking and requested that she refrain from using dark energy. As she knew, due to his debauched lifestyle, his dark energy capacity was far from what it might have been, so he would prefer an unarmed duel, if possible. Melon knew that even for a duel, allowing the heir to get hurt would be troublesome. She asked if he really thought he stood a chance in an unarmed fight. He replied that they would have to see, and asked her to choose his opponent. Then, flicking his fingers, he pointed at Thurn and told Melon that Thurn would do. Thurn was enraged and demanded to know how he dared. Melon told Chris it would be better to find a more suitable opponent and asked if he was aware that Thurn was a 2-star level fiend. 2-star. A level no ordinary 13-year-old could reach. Without raw talent, it didn't matter if someone was 13 or 23. They wouldn't even scratch the surface of such power. But Chris wasn't just any ordinary bastard. And he knew it. He shook his head and smiled at everyone, saying that if he had to prove himself anyway, it made more sense to fight someone stronger. He added that he thought fighting Thurn would be best. Then, looking at Thurn teasingly, he asked what he thought, and whether he was scared of his big brother. That enraged Thurn even more, and he accepted the duel. Moments later, the knights surrounded them and shouted for Thurn to take the opportunity to destroy Chris. They said if he sent Chris back in one piece, they'd all be getting special training that day. Chris ignored the hateful remarks thrown his way and asked Melon how the winner would be decided, whether the fight should continue until one side surrendered. Melon thought him insolent for not even knowing his place and mused that it would be nice if Thurn crippled him by taking a leg or two. She then answered that surrendering was too dull. They would fight until one side was incapacitated. Chris feigned surprise and teasingly asked Thurn if he heard the rules and what he planned to do now that everyone expected a serious beating. Thurn, furious, called him an insolent fool and swore to shut him up for good. But Chris suddenly punched Thurn in the face with such speed that it shocked him. Chris then teased, asking what was the matter and casually informed him that the fight had already begun. Thurn glared at him in fury and tried to punch him back, but Chris dodged it. He knew this fight was practically cheating. He hadn't even reached 1 star and didn't stand a chance against someone wielding dark energy. However, in a barehanded duel, Chris had fought on countless battlefields in his past life. Chris knew that. Counting only the power he had gained from the Dominion of Light and what he achieved in the Punishment Cave, he was already at 3-star. The knights were shocked upon witnessing the clash, stammering to one another about what they had just seen. Thurn clutched his stomach in pain and spat out blood. Chris then mockingly asked if he was crying and whether he wanted him to blow on that boo-boo, which enraged Thurn even further. Thurn asked what trick Chris had pulled. For Chris, seeing Thurn in that state was refreshing, but he kept his composure and replied that there was no trick, just asked whether it didn't mean that Thurn was a bit too weak. That remark sent Thurn over the edge. He released his dark energy, agreeing with Chris but seething with anger. Chris ignored the burst and teasingly asked what he had just said. He couldn't hear him because he was too quiet. Thurn then stretched his arm out and launched at him with high speed, shouting that he would kill him. Chris narrowly dodged his strike and teasingly commented on his speed. Thurn then launched a barrage of punches, but Chris dodged them all with ease. Chris blocked one of Thurn's arms and dissipated the dark energy, which stunned Thurn. Before he could react, Chris landed a clean punch to his chin, knocking Thurn out cold. He knew from experience, fighting was all about instinct. Thurn collapsed to the ground unconscious while the knights stood with open mouths, shocked and in disbelief. Chris slowly approached Thurn as the knights whispered among themselves, wondering if Thurn had let his guard down. Perhaps he had withdrawn his dark energy to avoid hurting Chris too badly. For all of them, including Melon, it didn't make sense unless Thurn had held back on purpose. Chris then turned to Melon and asked what she thought. Was it enough to prove he was qualified? She calmly replied yes. He thanked her for acknowledging it. Inside, he was proud and excited that it had worked. Outwardly, he remained calm and composed, thinking to himself that from now on, he would devour everything, swordsmanship and magic alike. Days later, in his room, he released his dark magic power and saw that he had finally reached 1 star in dark magic. He thought to himself that it had taken longer than expected, as he was still not fully accustomed to handling dark energy, and there was a lot of residue left behind by Christian. He rang the bell while thinking that he would need to raise his level even further for it to become possible to wield the power of light simultaneously. A ghost maid then appeared. It was Marie, Christian's assigned maid. He couldn't believe they were using a high-level evil spirit, a banshee, as a maid, but he understood it was likely due to Christian's constant troublemaking that they couldn't use anyone else. He silently swore that he would definitely replace her later and ordered her to bring him some juice so he could drink it and head off to train. She asked if she should prepare the juice with human blood, but he ordered her to make it with strawberries. Yet she moved closer and informed him that blood juice tasted super good. He was frightened, but managed to insist on strawberry. However, she tried to suggest blood juice again, pushing him to the edge, so he shouted at her to bring strawberry juice. A moment later, after drinking his strawberry juice, Cox arrived and asked if he was going to train even though it was still early. Cox expressed concern that Chris might be pushing himself too hard, but then he corrected himself and said he was actually pleased and proud of Chris's diligence, adding that he believed in him even when everyone else had pointed fingers. Chris, however, glared at Cox in irritation. He released a wave of dark energy and angrily asked him who he thought he was to decide whether to believe in him or not. He told Cox that he never asked for his belief in the first place. Startled, Cox bowed deeply and apologized for overstepping his bounds, then wished Chris a good training session before hurriedly leaving. Still, Chris was sure that something was fishy about Cox. Soon after, Chris arrived at the training ground and noticed that the knights' gazes looked more docile than before. He put his bag down and wondered if now, with their guard lowered, it might be possible to win them over little by little. He then began swinging his sword in training. One of the knights watched him for a moment before heading into the nearby tent, the resting office of the deputy commander. The knight entered Melon's office and reported that Chris had shown up at the training grounds again. Melon wondered what on earth he was plotting and what that duel had really been about. She recalled Thurn's movements during the fight were impressive, yet she still couldn't believe Chris had dispelled Thurn's dark energy at the perfect moment. She began to wonder whether Chris could see through the flow of battle. If that were true, then perhaps Chris even had the talent to surpass Lord Eshid de Baron, the direct heir of the main family. But then Melon's thoughts shifted again. She reminded herself that Chris was still a bastard who had already lost much of his dark energy through his debauched lifestyle. In her mind, it should have been impossible for him to close that gap now. Suddenly, she heard a loud noise from outside and rushed out of the tent to ask what was going on. One of the knights explained that Chris had apparently had a small conflict with a squire, and everyone was shocked to see that Cannon, a one-star fiend, had collapsed on the ground. The revelation sparked rumors and suspicions that Chris might have reached one star himself, leaving Melon equally stunned. Chris, standing confidently, told them that he had wanted to witness the legendary prowess of the Black Swamp Knights. But so far, they had failed to live up to their reputation. He then asked if no one else would step up, or if they really were just a cowardly order of knights. His words infuriated the knights. Just then, a massive knight stepped forward and introduced himself as Torin. Chris smiled, realizing they had fallen into his trap, and told Torin to come at him. Torin raised his wooden sword to attack. Chris knew they would never willingly teach a good-for-nothing bastard the secret techniques of the knights, so he had no choice but to steal them. He blocked Torin's attack and countered, closely observing the grip angle and fluid footwork. He tightened his hold on his wooden sword, identifying the mud swordsmanship he had only heard about in rumors. He guessed that if he performed it roughly, it would work. He copied the grip and footwork technique, then slashed his wooden sword at Torin's face. The blow shocked Melon even more, and Chris smiled proudly, knowing he had executed it perfectly. Just minutes later, Torin lay defeated on the ground, and Chris sat on top of him. The surrounding knights panicked, seeing that he was actually that strong, wondering whether his darkness core had truly been ruined and how he had reached one star. Amid the chaos, Melon stood frozen, realizing that she hadn't been mistaken after all. Chris looked around and coldly remarked that the display was disappointing. He added that it seemed he had placed too much faith in the knights, and if their skills were that pathetic, then perhaps their deputy commander should bear some of the responsibility. Hearing that, the knights panicked, wondering if they should stop Chris and thinking he was crazy for provoking Melon. Melon, barely containing her rage, told him that she understood his excitement from an unexpected victory, but asked if he wasn't getting a bit too carried away. Chris stood and replied by challenging her, suggesting that she show him the true skills of the Black Swamp Knights. Melon then drew the knight's sword beside her, shocking the knight, and sent a powerful slash near him. The ground cracked deeply from the force. She furiously called him a bastard and warned that she could deal with someone like him in just a second. He calmly asked her if she planned to fight someone like him using her full power, and proposed that they limit their dark energy to the one-star level and prohibit the use of dark magic. He also suggested that they use wooden swords as weapons. She grabbed the wooden one and pointed it at him, telling him she'd break both of his legs using just half of one-star power. He calmly told her that he would put his legs on the line and asked, "What about you?" She replied that anything was fine, because he wouldn't be walking away from there today. She then dashed toward him and swung her sword with force. He fortunately managed to block it, but she was far stronger than he was, and he struggled to hold his ground. She then bombarded him with attacks, but he managed to block each strike. The knights watching couldn't believe he was holding his own, considering he was up against the deputy commander. They speculated that perhaps it was only because Melon's main weapon was a greatsword. Melon, on the other hand, knew it wasn't about the weapon. For some reason, her attacks weren't landing on Chris. She reminded herself that Chris was a weakling through and through. He shouldn't be any match for her. But she began to question if what was happening now was similar to when he had fought Thurn, and even before that. Chris smiled upon seeing Melon's confusion and told her it looked like things weren't going her way, which infuriated her further. She told him to shut up, then tightened her grip on the sword. She then began gathering dark energy in her sword and sent a powerful slash in his direction, shattering the ground. Chris immediately dashed to the side, successfully dodging the blow. Then, at high speed, he charged toward her and headbutted her in the face, shocking her. She instinctively clutched her nose, even more surprised when she saw it bleeding. He was pleased that his plan had worked. Melon was a spell sword, and as long as her dark magic was bound, a lapse in defense would leave her unable to recover with physical strength alone, or so Chris had judged. He knew that if Melon were a pure sword-focused fiend, it might not have worked. Melon laughed loudly and admitted she never imagined he'd use a headbutt. She confessed that she had underestimated him too much and vowed to focus from that point on. He pointed at her neck and asked if the fight wasn't already over. She looked down and saw a faint scratch. He explained that he had scratched her with his nail during the headbutt and asked what would have happened if his nail had been laced with poison. Accepting defeat, she told him to name his desire, but in return she asked if she could have the opportunity to fight him again. He replied that if it meant a rematch, she would have to agree to a second request, to which she nodded. He then approached her and whisperingly asked if she would kneel before him. Startled, she whisperingly responded that she understood that it was an impossible condition to meet. Her loyalty lay with the main family of the Dark Magic clan, House Baron. He whispered back that he knew she was only there on an excursion from the main family, but asked her if that wouldn't resolve itself if he were to become the young lord of the clan. Shocked, she asked what he meant by young lord. She called it utter nonsense, reminding him that the 5 young lords whose succession rights had been recognized were all direct descendants of the main family. But he responded that there was no rule stating a branch family member couldn't become a young lord, and in any case, he accepted her dual request. He then asked Melon if they could have their rematch in a month, explaining that he needed time to train as well. He added that next time they would place clear limits on themselves. She told him that, if that were the case, he would have no chance of defeating her. But he simply replied, "Who knows?" and said that few things in this world were truly impossible, leaving her speechless. He then bowed gracefully and told her he would see her in a month. Internally, he swore that on that day, he would make Melon realize where her loyalty should truly lie. Later, he presented Melon's letter of recommendation to Count Khazar and reported that the Fiend's fundamentals were lacking, so they would need to place more focus on training. Count Khazar silently examined the letter and recalled Melon's report that Chris was a genius. Despite his low star rank, he had easily defeated others with solid foundations, and even she had been defeated by him. Count Khazar asked Melon to confirm whether she had been defeated as well. She admitted it and told him that it had been a rare fight, one she actually enjoyed. Count Khazar looked at Chris and thought, perhaps this time, he had truly changed. Chris was puzzled by Count Khazar's gaze and asked if there was something on his face. Count Khazar simply replied, nothing. He then granted Chris the key to the library, as promised. After receiving it, Chris stepped out of the room and proudly raised the key, congratulating himself. He had not only obtained access to the library, but also managed to change Melon's mind. He knew that Melon was a fiend from the main family of the Dark Magic clan, and that, during the Age of Destruction, she had been active as a 6-star High Fiend. If he wanted to take control of the entire Dark Magic clan, he needed to make Melon one of his own. Chris understood that he hadn't completely won Melon over yet, but he was confident 1 month would be enough. His arrogant self firmly believed he was a genius. As he walked away from the office, he thought back to Count Khazar's expression and wondered if it had been a look of fatherly pride. Perhaps fiends had familial attachments too. Maybe Count Khazar would turn out to be a better father than the one Chris had in his previous life. Entering the library, he swore to his new father that he would not disappoint him. He was immediately amazed by the library's contents. There were books on blood magic, summoning studies, curse studies, and more, all topics forbidden in the Dominion of Light. He picked a book from the shelf and began to pull it out. But then Marie appeared behind it and emerged, startling him so badly he stumbled and shouted, asking why she was there. Laughing, she asked, "Why else?" and explained that she had once been the librarian of the place, leaving him even more confused. Marie then shyly covered her chest and asked if he perhaps wanted to monopolize her as his personal servant girl, which disgusted him. He immediately ordered her to shut up, but she didn't stop, telling him that her heart was going to explode from his direct language. This infuriated him even more, and he shouted again for her to shut up. Yet she just laughed. Marie then noticed that the grimoire he had chosen contained a 4-star dark magic spell called Binding Seal, and she told him that, as he wouldn't be able to comprehend it. He shut the book arrogantly and told her it was fine, because he was a genius. Marie was left speechless for a few seconds, then acted proud and declared that not only was he a genius, but he was also handsome. That irritated him, and he told her not to force it. She then asked if there was a reason he specifically chose that book. He replied yes, because he needed to catch a rat. The next day, he was at the training grounds doing the morning run alongside the other knights. As he ran, he thought about who the rat might be. The first suspect was Thurn. No one in the house despised him more for being a good-for-nothing. The second was Cox. Even though Cox wasn't a descendant of the clan, he had free access to the punishment cave. Chris also knew that among fiends, power was more important than social status, yet Cox clung to him, constantly flattering him. He guessed it could even be a third party he wasn't yet aware of. Either way, whoever was behind it clearly wanted to see him in ruins, especially after they slipped the Dreamstone into the punishment cave. He stopped running and considered whether he should act like the bastard they wanted him to be. He knew that whoever looked most pleased with him behaving badly was likely the culprit, so he cursed loudly and shouted that it was way too hard, then walked off, telling the knights to enjoy their run. He quit. The other knights were left confused, asking each other what was going on with him. Later, at the dining table, he threw a plate of food onto the floor, prompting Count Khazar to rise furiously and shout his name. Chris simply responded that the servant should have served him proper food to begin with. He then arrogantly yelled at the servants not to just stand there and ordered them to remake his meal. Count Khazar glared at him in anger and said he was a fool to think he had finally matured. Then, disappointed, Count Khazar left the table. Chris felt a little bad but reminded himself it was for the good of their family. He hoped Count Khazar would eventually understand. In the following days, Chris wanted everyone to call him the Devil. He worked hard to spread rumors that he had gone back to being a bastard. He bullied maids during their cleaning, spent money like it meant nothing, and tormented everyone around him. One day, Marie poured juice into his wine glass, which made him furious. He shouted at her, asking why she wouldn't let him drink wine. Laughing, she told him he was drinking wine, just non-alcoholic. That enraged him even more, and he yelled that she had removed the alcohol. Marie calmly explained that he was underage and shouldn't be drinking in the first place. He asked her why that mattered when he was already a good-for-nothing bastard. She then asked if he had really decided to become a bastard again, and sweetly added that, regardless, she would always stay by his side. That disgusted him. He released a dark spell and reminded her that he had already told her. He was hunting a rat. Marie was surprised to see the dark magic and asked if he had already mastered the Binding Seal spell. He proudly reminded her that he was a genius and that he had modified it to be usable, even at a lower star level. He added that he hadn't just been goofing off, he had been working hard, mastering various spells. But suddenly, Thurn barged into his room, slamming the door open just as Marie was asking him if he was truly a genius. Chris immediately acted drunk, letting out a hiccup as he asked Thurn what was going on and why he was there. Thurn furiously demanded to know if this was really the best he could do, shouting that he thought Chris had changed for the better. Chris smirked, realizing that Thurn's anger was genuine. He could now cross Thurn off his list of suspects. Calmly, he told Thurn that he believed there was a rat in the house. Thurn was confused and asked what he was talking about. Chris explained that someone wanted to see him fall, and he intended to play along with their scheme for a little while. Thurn asked if he was saying everything had been an act, and Chris confirmed it with a nod. He then pointed his wine glass at Thurn's nose and told him even the wine was fake. Thurn sniffed the glass and realized it was juice. He asked who the rat was, but Chris replied that it was hard to say for now. They just had to wait for the bait to be taken. Then, Chris purposely threw the wine glass onto the floor. A servant quickly rushed into the room asking if something was wrong. Chris shouted that the wine wasn't what he asked for and ordered the servant to tell the butler to bring him another bottle. The servant nervously responded that Cox was currently preoccupied. Chris asked if Cox was busy, then said he'd pay him a visit himself, still maintaining his drunken act. Thurn was surprised by how convincing the performance was. Minutes later, Chris arrived at Cox's office and slammed the wine bottle down on the desk in front of him. Cox asked what brought him there, but Chris picked up the bottle again and poured the liquid over Cox's head. Slurring his words, Chris accused him of looking down on him, saying the wine wasn't what he had asked for. Cox immediately stood up and insisted he wasn't looking down on him and would send someone to fetch the proper wine right away. But Chris disagreed and ordered Cox to get it himself. Cox clenched his fists in frustration and told him that he was in the middle of something. Chris responded mockingly, asking if Cox planned to keep working in that state and reminding him that he should change, so he'd better get going. Grinding his teeth, Cox tried to calm himself and agreed. He walked away, unaware that Chris was watching him closely. In truth, Cox was struggling to contain his rage, thinking he should be commended for his patience but unable to suppress the hostility building inside. Once Cox was gone, Chris looked at the papers on the desk. He examined them carefully and smirked. He had a feeling Cox might be the rat. If so, he'd likely be involved in shady dealings related to the finances. But the evidence wasn't enough yet. He needed a real smoking gun. He put the papers back in place, just as Cox returned with the wine bottle Chris had requested. Chris thanked him and asked if he was mad at him. Cox immediately replied no, saying he could never be mad at him. Laughing, Chris praised Cox and told him that, though he didn't know if he should say it, Cox was his favorite. Cox bowed and responded that he was very grateful. Then Cox reported that he had a message for him. When Chris asked what it was, Cox said that his friends wished to meet him in secret at the usual place. That left Chris confused. He wasn't sure which friends Cox was referring to. Cox then feigned concern, saying he would rather Chris not associate with them, though it wasn't his place to judge his friends. Seeing Cox's reaction, Chris replied that he would go meet them, and Cox reluctantly agreed, acting as if he had no choice. Chris smiled inwardly, thinking that things were going even better than he expected. The next day, at the secret meeting place, his so-called friends expressed their excitement, saying they had heard rumors that he had changed recently, but they didn't believe it for a second. To them, he had always been the best among them. He looked at the young female servant pouring wine for them and grew irritated, thinking to himself how trashy these men were to make such a young girl serve them drinks. The men raised their wine glasses together, and the chubby man suggested they drink. Chris picked up his wine glass and smelled the contents. The men asked what he was doing and urged him to drink already. Instead, he threw the wine in the chubby man's face. The man panicked at the spilled wine and asked what Chris thought he was doing. Chris calmly responded that he knew they had tainted the sacred alcohol. From their reactions, he guessed they were fully aware that something was in it. They tried to explain, but he raised his finger and pressed it against the lady servant's forehead, releasing a bit of light magic, causing her to fall into a deep sleep. Both men were shocked to see him using magic and questioned if he knew dark magic. He slammed his foot onto the table in frustration, saying that now wasn't the time to be surprised. He then grabbed both of them by the hair and slammed their faces into the table. Without stopping, he continued to bash their heads against it until they begged him to stop. The chubby man cried out, asking why he was doing this and pleaded with them to calm down. Chris smirked and pulled something from inside his jacket. He said that if they still didn't understand what they had done wrong after this, they could just die right there. Then he revealed a sharp knife. Moments later, the room was a mess with the two men tied up in ropes. The skinny one pleaded fearfully for mercy as Chris drove his knife into the floor dangerously close to him, causing the man to wet himself in terror. The skinny man then confessed that they were ordered to drug Chris and frame him after killing the girl. The chubby man added that the one who gave the order had blackmailed them using their involvement in illegal drug trafficking, leaving them no choice. Chris asked who gave the order. The skinny man looked away, hesitant to speak. Chris kicked the knife deeper into the floor and asked if they wanted their eggplant cut off. Screaming in panic, the skinny man admitted it was Cox. Both men begged for their lives and promised to do anything. Chris asked again if they meant it and if they truly swore. When they nodded frantically, he acted as if he hadn't heard them, prompting them to shout that they swore. He smiled, said he would take their word for it, and cast the binding seal dark magic spell on both of them, placing the seal on their heads. As they screamed in pain, the spell took effect, and both men collapsed. The next day, Cox burst into Count Khazar's office in a panic, shouting that there was a problem. Count Khazar asked what happened. Cox reported that Chris had committed murder. Shocked, Count Khazar stood up abruptly. Cox continued, saying that it appeared Chris had gotten drunk the night before, killed the girl who had been serving drinks, and thrown her body into the river. He added that this was not something that could be covered up easily and asked what they should do. Grinding his teeth, Count Khazar ordered that Chris be brought to the Fiend Court and that he would invoke his immediate trial authority. As he walked away, he failed to notice the subtle, satisfied smile forming on Cox's face. Later, in the Fiend Court, Count Khazar stood on the stage while Chris remained at the defendant's stand. When Count Khazar finished stating the charges, Chris confidently denied everything and declared that he was innocent. This response angered Count Khazar further, and he demanded to know how Chris dared to lie in the presence of witnesses. Chris calmly asked how there could be witnesses when nothing had happened and stated that there must be some misunderstanding, while subtly glancing at his two friends seated nearby. He then called for the lady servant and asked if the so-called dead servant they were referring to was that very girl, which shocked both men. The girl confessed that Chris had taken her home after she regained consciousness and had even given her money to help pay her rent. She then pointed to the two men and revealed to everyone that they were the real culprits, as they had drugged Chris's drink. The courtroom was thrown into confusion as people struggled to grasp what was happening. Before the two men could respond, Chris activated the binding seal he had placed on their minds, bringing the situation to its climax. The two men began panicking upon seeing the servant girl, but then their eyes rolled back as the binding seal triggered. Both of them, under its influence, confessed that they had given false reports under Cox's orders to frame Chris. Cox, now visibly panicked, accused the two men of spouting nonsense. He turned to Count Kazar and insisted that it was slander, claiming that Chris and his friends were conspiring to frame him. Cox shouted that the joke had gone too far. Chris, unfazed, sighed. He had expected Cox to react this way. He then addressed Count Kazar and asked if he could make one request as the victim in the incident. Count Kazar asked what it was. Chris requested permission to act as a proxy of Count Kazar's authority to directly question Cox. Count Kazar was speechless at the request, especially when he saw Chris's confident smile. After a pause, Count Kazar agreed to grant the authority and ordered Cox to step into the defendant's stand. Cox attempted to argue, but Count Kazar ignored him and warned Chris that if he acted inappropriately, the authority would be revoked immediately. Chris agreed and assured him that he would finish quickly. Chris then ascended the stage and formally declared that, as a representative of the great ruler of the Magic Empire, His Majesty the Demon Emperor, as a member of the Dark Magic clan governing the eastern region of the Southern Magic Kingdom, and as a representative of Count Kazar, he would now begin questioning the defendant. He turned to Cox and asked if he swore to answer truthfully to his words. Cox responded that he did. Chris asked again, this time invoking the authority of the Demon Emperor, and Cox raised his palm and swore once more. At that moment, Chris activated the binding seal spell on Cox's head, shocking everyone. Cox screamed in pain as the mark appeared on his forehead. The nobles present, watching as witnesses, could not believe a mere boy had cast a 4-star dark magic spell. What they didn't know was that the binding seal Chris had used was modified to function even at a lower star rank, with a condition. The target had to swear twice. Cox had walked straight into Chris's trap. Cox screamed, demanding to know what Chris had done. Chris asked in return if Cox hadn't just sworn to answer truthfully, and then questioned the reason Cox had hired those two men to frame him. As Chris controlled the binding seal within Cox's mind, the pain intensified, forcing Cox to admit that he had been ordered by someone who knew of his corruption and had threatened him. Cox added that the person had instructed him to ruin Chris, which is why he had tried to sabotage him from a young age, something Count Kazar could hardly believe. Chris asked if Cox was referring to the embezzlement he had been committing for some time and informed him that he had already seen through it. Then, stepping closer, Chris asked who had given him the order. Cox begged him to stop, but Chris tightened the control on the binding seal. Cox screamed again, then stuttered out the name, Eshid. Chris didn't release the spell, pushing further until Cox shouted the full name, the second son of the Dark Magic clan, Eshid de Baron. Chris then released the spell. Cox, overwhelmed by pain and fear, tried to flee, knowing that Eshid would likely kill him. Chris then pulled the knight's sword, and without hesitation, he slashed off Cox's head in front of the entire court. Count Kazar was stunned in disbelief. Chris, calm and composed, addressed the court and declared that, under the borrowed authority of the Count, he had executed judgment on the sinner. Count Kazar then asked him why that was the decision he had made. Chris replied that if they had left Cox alive, the main family would have fabricated evidence and covered up the incident. As he continued kicking Cox's body, he added that they could not afford to be indulgent. More importantly, he intended to ensure that everyone present would remember the truth of what happened. This surprised both Thurn and Melon, who were watching from the side. He then reminded them that Eshid had attempted to sabotage him, which caused Count Kazar visible concern. Count Kazar opened a portal and ordered him to follow, which Chris did without hesitation. Once they arrived in another place, Chris asked where they were. Count Kazar replied that it was a secret training ground and explained that there were too many eyes in the courtroom. Count Kazar then asked if he meant to say that Eshid would cause more trouble because of the succession conflict. Chris nodded in response. Count Kazar admitted that the power and authority of a family are directly tied to the successor they support, and while Chris's decision may have been correct, it still felt hasty. Nevertheless, given the current situation, they would have no choice but to support the first young lady, as the first young lord was a crazed, bloodthirsty lunatic. Chris told him that there was another option. He himself would become the successor. Count Kazar was stunned and called the idea nonsense. Chris explained that someone from a branch family could be recognized as a successor if they possessed the necessary ability. Count Kazar reminded him that it was merely a rule in name and rarely enforced. Chris responded that he didn't know about the politics, but asked why Count Kazar thought Eshid had tried to sabotage him. Count Kazar replied that Chris might have been more talented than Eshid in childhood, but now he was far behind. Chris confidently said he would catch up quickly, and to do that, he needed Count Kazar's help. He asked Count Kazar to use his authority to recommend him for participation in the Sacred Dark Rite 2 months from now. Count Kazar warned him that one must reach 2-star to participate, and asked if he understood that he had only just reached 1-star. Chris, undeterred, assured him that he would reach 2-star within 2 months. When Count Kazar remained silent, Chris called him father and asked once more for his help. Days later, in Count Kazar's castle, rumors spread rapidly about Chris's complete transformation. Word was that Count Kazar had been personally training him, training so difficult that even senior knights struggled with it. Meanwhile, in the secret training ground, Chris easily slashed a huge mushroom, noting to himself that he should bind it using mud swordsmanship and sever it using black scythe swordsmanship. Count Kazar was speechless upon hearing this, as he had only begun teaching black scythe swordsmanship that very day, yet Chris had immediately grasped it. Another mushroom appeared behind Count Kazar, and Chris asked if he really needed to approach it the way they had been doing. He questioned whether keeping the techniques so separate was truly efficient, which left Count Khazar momentarily confused. Chris then dashed toward the mushroom, saying he felt there must be a more effective method. He swung his sword, effortlessly slicing through the mushroom in a single motion. Count Khazar noticed it was mud swordsmanship and asked how Chris had managed to do that. Chris explained that the human-like mushroom's limbs were tough enough to merit mud swordsmanship, but he had wrapped it in the sword energy of Black Scythe. Count Khazar was deeply shocked inside, knowing that a 1-star should not be capable of such a feat. Yet he maintained a calm demeanor and admitted the combination was quite powerful. However, he warned that using 2 techniques at once would make it difficult to cast curses. Chris replied that it was super easy. He then demonstrated a combined technique using both mud swordsmanship and Black Scythe swordsmanship, while simultaneously unleashing curse magic. He remarked that it was barely an inconvenience. At that moment, Count Khazar could no longer hide his shock. 15 days later, he was lying on the training ground in exhaustion, complaining that running was far too difficult. It wasn't something he could half-heartedly do, especially since stamina was crucial for increasing his power stage. Someone then blocked the sunlight from his face and asked if he was already exhausted. It was Melon. She reminded him that the duel wasn't far off and said she was eagerly awaiting the promised day. He noticed that she always carried that intense presence and sat up, assuring her that he was doing his best to meet her expectations. Melon acknowledged his incredible growth but pointed out that he was still a 1-star. She warned that if he failed to meet her expectations, he would never get her to kneel before him. He stood up and admitted that might be the case, but even then, he believed he would learn something from the duel, so it wouldn't be for nothing. Melon laughed and told him he was still full of energy. She walked away, hoping he would push past his limits and entertain her. He knew she was currently an upper 4-star. Within a single stage, there were 3 separate tiers, lower, middle, and upper. Chris, being an upper 1-star, was still far below Melon. However, Chris also knew that he came from a rich family. In other words, he considered himself a wallet warrior. The next day, he asked Marie if she had finished packing his bag for the outing. She proudly confirmed that she had and then spun around, showing off her dress. She told him it was their first outing together, so she had dressed to impress. He was shocked upon hearing that and shouted that he never said she was coming along. Marie just laughed and acted shy, claiming she knew he must be worried she'd get heat stroke. She added that it was her pleasure to serve him, which only frustrated him more. He asked how a banshee could possibly get heat stroke. He then recalled how, days earlier, he had asked Count Khazar if he could switch to a human attendant. Count Khazar replied that he couldn't, because a master-servant contract had already been established with Marie. He explained that a high-ranking banshee couldn't be managed without such a contract. Panicking, Chris had asked if there was any way to void it. Count Khazar sighed and replied that he believed it would require sharing a deep kiss with Marie, and reminded him that he had been quite drunk the day the contract was made. Chris had scratched his head in frustration, thinking Count Khazar was so unhelpful, and blamed Christian, as usual, for being a good-for-nothing. Back in the present, he told Marie that she couldn't come because he was heading to a place crowded with people. Marie looked disappointed, and said she had been looking forward to the excursion. He tried to explain that her spiritual energy might harm others, but she began tearing up and told him she had been confined to the mansion for decades. Seeing her tears, he was dumbfounded. In the end, he forcefully agreed to let her come, but ordered her not to show herself around others. She released hearts into the air, thanked him excitedly, and praised him for being the best. He simply turned away and told her to follow him. As they walked through the castle, Marie asked where they were going. He replied that they were heading to a place where he could make a profit. Marie lifted her skirt to reveal a handful of coins and told him that he already had plenty of money. He panicked and shouted that it wasn't a lot, then ordered her to put the gold back. Marie, confused, asked if it was gold or land ownership. He replied that she had it wrong. When she asked what it actually was, he explained that it was for something he used to use before. He then opened the carriage door, only to be startled when he saw Thurn already inside, telling him that he was late. Chris asked what Thurn was doing there. Thurn replied that he was there to watch over him in case he started acting like a bastard again. Chris assured him that wouldn't happen and said he was simply on his way to go gambling, which shocked Thurn. He explained that they were fiends, and being close to alcohol and gambling was practically expected. He added that gambling was even recommended by the Demon Emperor, and there was a reason it was legal. Despite this, Thurn insisted he would follow him, which confused Chris. He sat down across from Thurn and asked if he was worried about his big brother. Thurn was startled by the question and stuttered, asking why he would be worried. He quickly shouted that he was only concerned about Chris bringing dishonor to the family. As the carriage began to move, Chris told Thurn that for someone like him, a little nerd, it would probably be too stimulating. He asked if Thurn even knew the rules. Thurn snapped back, saying gambling was just card games, and swore that he would flatten that cocky nose of his. Chris, playing along, acted afraid and claimed he was terrified. In truth, he smiled warmly on the outside, but called Thurn a sweet summer child in his arrogant thoughts, already confident that today's pushover was Thurn. A moment later, they arrived at a massive casino castle. Thurn commented that he never imagined a building could look like that, while Marie added that her heart was starting to flutter. Chris handed a tiger mask to Thurn, telling him to stop acting like a country bumpkin and wear it. Entry required their identities to be concealed. He then ordered Marie to remain hidden so no one could see her and leaned in to whisper something to her, which surprised her. Laughing as she left, Marie said she would carry out his order. As Chris put on his black mask, Thurn asked where Marie was going, but Chris simply told him it wasn't anything he needed to worry about and suggested they head in. The nobles and servants inside paused and turned their attention toward them the moment they entered. Though Chris and Thurn walked peacefully, the nobles playing inside viewed them as clueless newcomers, born and bred suckers walking right into the lion's den. Chris then turned to Thurn and asked if he wanted to place a bet on who could make more money in an hour. He offered that if Thurn won, Chris would call him older brother for a month. Thurn asked if he really meant it, and Chris confirmed, but added that if Thurn lost, he would have to call him Honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother. Thurn was confused, but Chris handed him a packet of money and told him he didn't have to accept the challenge if he was scared. Angered, Thurn grabbed the money from his hand and asked who said anything about being scared, then rushed off to play with fiery determination, declaring that he would go first. Chris took a seat at a card table. An old man beside him said it was clearly his victory and commented that if he played a bit more, he'd probably earn a lot since he was quite good. Chris acted thrilled and loudly remarked that his luck was great today, but he knew exactly how these cons worked. Early on, the house let newcomers win a modest amount to build confidence, and once the target grew overconfident, they would bait them into betting big. Chris knew this routine well. Soon, he heard Thurn shouting that it made no sense. He was sure he had a good card. Chris smirked, thinking that Thurn was already caught in their trap. He teasingly asked Thurn why he didn't just go home and get some sleep, which infuriated Thurn. Thurn snapped back, asking if Chris wasn't also losing money. Chris replied that he had only lost 500 rupees. Thurn then shouted that he had only lost about 1,000 rupees, prompting whispers from the surrounding tables. Chris was glad to notice that the gamblers around them had already marked Thurn as a sucker. He was certain that a con man would reel him in soon. He asked if Thurn was planning to continue. Thurn angrily snatched more money from his hand and declared that he would keep going. As Thurn turned to resume playing, Chris teasingly reminded him that he had tried to stop him. But in truth, he wanted Thurn to lose as much as possible and become the perfect bait. A moment later, Thurn was sitting seriously at the desk, peeking at his cards without noticing the servant and conman around him, quietly tricking him. Chris then saw the man next to Thurn slap his hand on his knee, exactly the signal he had been waiting for. At that moment, Marie appeared invisibly beside him and reported that she had located the men he had mentioned. Chris praised her for her excellent work, while Thurn in the background was losing his mind after losing 10,000 rupees. Minutes later, Chris arrived at the target location with Marie's help and ordered her to open the door, which she did. As they stepped inside, the fiends inside were shocked. They immediately blocked his path and demanded to know who he was. Removing his mask, he asked if they hadn't recognized him by now. Realization dawned as they guessed he was the bastard young master, then asked what business he had there. Chris ordered them to call their master. Soon after, Grantel, the head of the Grantel Merchant Guild, appeared with a worried expression and asked if Chris had come for a visit. Chris knew Grantel had a reputation for his talents as a merchant, but in truth, he was a corrupt person. Chris told him he had come to speak privately. Grantel asked what it could be about, and Chris replied that Grantel's people had conned his younger brother, someone he deeply cared about, and yet had the nerve to act unaware. Grantel was startled and asked if Thurn was the man in the tiger mask. Chris confirmed it and reminded Grantel that Thurn was Count Khazar's hero. Grantel quickly tried to distance himself from the incident, claiming he only managed the casino and had no part in what others did. Chris asked if he wanted to die. At that moment, Marie revealed herself in her true form as a banshee, which terrified Grantel completely. He immediately dropped to his knees and apologized, explaining that if he had known Thurn was Count Khazar's son, he would never have allowed such a thing to happen. Grantel begged for mercy. Chris asked if his words weren't just empty promises, to which Grantel insisted they were genuine and that he would compensate them. When asked how much, Chris responded with 1 million rupees, which shocked Grantel. Grantel explained that they didn't have that kind of money on hand. Chris then requested 200,000 instead. Grantel, knowing that amount equaled their entire fortune, asked if that would truly suffice. Chris replied yes, but added that there was something else he needed from them as well. Grantel, now trembling, asked what it was. A moment later, after shopping for weapons, Marie commented in disbelief that he had used the 200,000 rupees he extorted to purchase battle gear. She proudly said it was truly a super scheme. Chris confidently agreed. Marie then pointed to a sword Grantel had given him, recognizing it as Grunade, a holy sword once obtained by a hero who had offered up his soul. She mentioned that many fiends had sought it since it was the weapon used after that hero's fall, though now it was rusty. Chris replied that it was fine, it was all part of the plan. He then told her to shut up and handed her something, asking if he was right that she had kept looking at it earlier. Marie saw that it was a necklace with a flower pendant. Chris explained that it was a gift for her, saying he thought she might never be able to put her regrets to rest without it. He said he was giving it to her so she could quickly find peace and move on, and warned her not to misunderstand. Marie admitted that, both before and after her death, this was the first time she had received a gift like that. She thanked him wholeheartedly. Chris replied that it was fine and told her they should head home. She happily agreed, hugging the necklace he had given her. As they walked, she promised to put her whole heart into repaying him and said she would now make him blood juice even tastier than before. He was startled and reminded her that he had said he wouldn't drink anything like that. He shouted that she was repaying his kindness with enmity. Marie then casually revealed that the blood had already been mixed into the strawberry juice he'd been drinking all this time. Disgusted, he asked if she was joking and told her to stop making horrifying remarks. He then came to a halt, suddenly feeling like he was forgetting something. Deciding it wasn't important, he chose to ignore the feeling, assuming it would come back to him later. Unaware that he had left Thurn behind in the casino, trembling in rage with only 1 rupee left to his name. The next day, in the early morning, Thurn rushed into his room in anger and called out to him. He woke up, confused, just as someone snatched the pillow from under his head. When he sat up, Thurn angrily demanded to know why he had abandoned him, shouting that he was nearly sold off as a debt slave because of him. Only then did he realize what he had forgotten. Thurn then yelled that he was lucky someone had recognized him. Yawning, he apologized to Thurn and guessed that Grantel had helped him out. He then asked Thurn if he wasn't addressing him incorrectly and reminded him that he had lost the bet and needed to keep his promise. He told Thurn to call him Esteemed King Emperor Majesty Brother, as they had agreed, which left Thurn momentarily speechless. Thurn trembled with rage and tried his best to say it while he picked his nose, pretending not to hear. Thurn then tore the pillow in half and shouted the title at him. Esteemed King Emperor Majesty Brother. He flicked his booger away with a wink and teasingly told Thurn to make sure to respect him and strive to do well himself as well. This infuriated and disgusted Thurn, leaving him speechless. Thurn stormed out, shouting that he would have his revenge one day, and warned him to prepare himself. He smiled, realizing that the adorable Thurn, who would grow up to try and kill Christian, was probably all because of Christian. He then remembered Eskid, the son of Langham, the acting clan head of the Dark Magic Land, and the current rank One Young Lord. He didn't feel much toward Eskid, as he wasn't the real Christian, but he knew that if he wanted to become the Young Lord, he couldn't avoid a confrontation with him. He planned to repay that brotherly grudge soon. Still, he figured that to do so, he would need to get Melon on his side. He then looked beside him and saw the bag of weapons with Grenade resting next to it. He got dressed and approached Grenade, knowing that at one point countless fiends had attempted to wield the Holy Sword. The reason Grenade was now treated as just an antique was because no one had ever been able to wield it. He decided to see how it would react to him. He picked it up by the chain wrapped around it, but it released a surge of electricity, electrocuting his hand and forcing him to drop it. Surprised, he realized it was rejecting dark energy, and figured it was to be expected, as it was an artifact made to channel the holy power of light. However, he believed that in the end, it was still just a weapon, and if he could analyze the mechanism that caused it to reject dark energy, he would be able to use it. He pulled a hammer from the bag and began striking Grenade. It emitted more electricity and tried to resist him, but he ignored the pain and struck it again, only for the hammer to shatter into pieces. Teasingly, he asked if it hurt, then pulled out 2 more hammers of different kinds. He told the sword to just submit already because he was planning to hit it all night, causing Grenade to tremble in fear at his determination. A few days later, in the secret training grounds, Count Khazar stood with Thurn and a lady. He asked him if his preparations were complete. He replied yes, then asked who the lady with them was. As he looked closer, he guessed that he had seen her somewhere before. When the lady turned to face him, he immediately recognized her and respectfully greeted the Knight Commander of the Black Shadow Knights, Marion. The commander greeted him in return, remarking that it had been a while. Marion was the daughter of the Elder Clan head, the master of the Dark Magic Clan, and the older sister of both Count Khazar and Viscount Langham. As protector of the Elder Clan head, she was in charge of secret missions and internal surveillance, an elite among elites of the Dark Magic Clan. This made him wonder why such a significant figure had appeared there. Count Khazar then explained that Marion had come for matters concerning Cox and that her visit was unofficial. Marion laughed and said that Eskid had committed quite the cheeky act. He began to wonder if Marion was planning to protect Eskid, which would be problematic. He told Marion that it seemed the Elder Clan head had a lot of free time if he was tending to such trivial matters. She responded that it was brazen to assume so. The clan head had no interest in the squabbles of children. Rather, he seemed to be interested in him, which surprised him. Still, he considered that this might be a chance to gain the clan head's favor. But then Marion questioned whether it was bravery or idiocy, reminding him that he hadn't even reached 2-star rank and was already challenging Melon. She asked him to call off the duel. He tightly gripped Grenade and thanked Marion for her concern, but said he had his own plans, all while unwrapping the sword's chains. Marion was shocked and asked if that sword truly was Grenade. She told him he had officially gone insane. She'd always known he was a troublemaker, but not to that extent. She then turned to Count Khazar, calling him by his first name, Radon, and asked if he still stood by his claim that Christian had changed for the better. Radon confirmed it, but Marion challenged his belief, pointing out that this was the same Christian who now intended to use a holy sword in a duel. He asked Marion whether he wasn't allowed to use a holy sword and stated that all that mattered was victory, no matter what method or trick was needed. Marion informed him that even the Elder Clan head had failed to tame Grenade and warned him that the sword's holy power would burn him to ashes. He simply asked if that was so and removed the sword's cover. Marion shouted that it was dangerous, but he successfully wielded the sword in front of them, leaving her speechless. Marion then asked if it was a replica. He tossed Grenade toward her and asked if she wanted to check it herself. She caught the sword, but it immediately released a surge of electricity upon sensing her dark energy. She quickly dropped it to the ground and demanded to know how he was doing it. He picked up Grenade, now completely unreactive in his hands, and told her it was a trade secret he couldn't share. He slung Grenade over his shoulder and told Marion she could at least be certain of one thing. The only reason he could wield the sword that even the Elder Clan head had failed to tame was because he was a genius. Marion was surprised, but the words moved his father. Suddenly, a loud laugh echoed through the training grounds. A voice said it was always so entertaining, drawing everyone's attention. They turned to see Melon stepping through the portal. Melon couldn't believe he had tamed a holy sword, but she then dismissed it and asked why it mattered. With a menacing grin, she declared that today would be his last day in that world. Melon then dashed forward and swung her sword toward him. Fortunately, he blocked it with Grenade. As he expected, Melon's power and speed were now incomparable to before. Without any restrictions, she was overwhelming. She dashed at him again, and he realized he wouldn't be able to close that gap at all. He blocked Melon's sword again, and Grenade released a burst of light magic to deflect the dark magic infused in her blade. Something both Radon and Marion took note of. Marion turned to Radon and asked if she was right in thinking that, at that level, Chris had already surpassed him when he was younger. But Radon replied that this wasn't the end of it. As they watched Chris struggling to block Melon's relentless attacks, Radon asked Marion if she could see how Chris was moving in order to wield the holy sword. They observed the light emanating from Grenade weaken every time his dark magic flared. Still, Melon was clearly struggling to block his strikes, which now contained both light and dark energy. Radon remarked that the power was incredible, but Chris's dark energy seemed unstable. Marion disagreed, explaining that Chris was deliberately controlling his dark energy at every single moment to prevent the Holy Sword from rejecting him. Meanwhile, he managed to push Melon away and asked her how it was, and whether the battle was to her liking. She ignored the question and admitted she'd been having a thought for a while. She asked if he had been predicting her movements. He calmly replied that he happened to be quite observant. He explained that every sword technique had a preceding motion. She had to raise her arms before swinging down, which involved specific movements of her shoulders and upper body. It was something both novices and experts had in common. She sighed, releasing a surge of dark energy, and asked him what about it. She then wrapped the dark energy around him and teasingly reminded him that the Black Swamp Knights were spell swords. Unfortunately for her, a holy magic burst erupted from within him and cleansed the dark energy surrounding him. He sighed in relief, knowing that could have been a serious problem. Confused, she asked if it was a cleansing artifact, but he ignored her question and sweetly thanked Radon, saying he only survived thanks to him, even though Radon had no idea he'd taken it, knowing it should have been secured in the secret vault. He casually admitted that he was prone to theft sometimes, leaving both Thurn and Radon in disbelief that he was proud of such behavior. He then pulled something from inside his coat, explaining that in real battles, having good equipment was a skill in itself. He threw the object above Melon, which shocked her. It exploded, releasing a blast of dark energy. She narrowly dodged it, but he immediately threw another projectile and told her it was no use trying to dodge. The second blast erupted in powerful flames, surprising him with its strength. He was glad he'd taken money from Grantel to purchase such artifacts. They were proving very effective. He teasingly called out that he knew she was still alive and told her to come out already. Suddenly, a great sword flew out of the flames, heading straight toward him. He calmly raised Grenade and blocked the incoming blade. The sword cracked and shattered into pieces. Radon proudly commented that he had been wondering why Chris had thrown that corrosion marble into the air, and reminded Marion that he had said Chris was a genius. Marion remained calm but agreed with him. Melon emerged from the flames, furious, and walked toward him. She smirked and dashed forward at high speed, shouting that this was too much fun, and asked what his next move would be. Marion and Radon both panicked, realizing Melon had lost her mind. But he calmly stepped aside and blocked her fist, deflecting it away with a powerful slap. Melon was stunned that he had deflected her attack so easily. He immediately closed the distance between them and swung Grenade toward her neck. He told her that it looked like it was his victory, and asked if it had been satisfying enough for her. Melon, with a scratch on her face, stood in shock. Radon was filled with pride at his son's display, while Marion was left in disbelief. Then Melon burst into laughter and asked if he was seriously asking her that question, when she couldn't even calm herself down anymore. He told her to give him her answer to his earlier request as soon as possible. Although the victory was his, he said he would respect her decision if she refused, because loyalty was not something that could be forced. She asked if he would continue fighting her like that in the future if she chose to stand by his side. He helped her to her feet and replied that he would, however much she wanted. A moment later, Marion sat in a guest room in Khazar's estate, still unable to believe how Chris was wielding dark energy like that. She remembered the Elder Clan Head's refusal to tame Grenade and asked him if it had been impossible for him as well. The Elder Clan Head replied that while he could wield it momentarily, as she knew, the waves of dark energy were always shifting. To wield Grenade, one would need to constantly adapt those waves into something the sword could not detect, and asked who could possibly do that in real combat. He then speculated that perhaps only a demon of Gehenna or the demonic dragon could manage it. Or, if not them, then maybe a crazy bastard who could control dark energy as naturally as breathing. Marion then remembered Chris proudly asking how he had done, and if it had been enough to earn her praise. She smiled as she recalled his confident grin and wondered, maybe her father's long-held wish could finally be fulfilled. The next day, in Khazar Castle's kitchen, he spotted a chief orc carefully cutting something, but it turned out to be just a small strawberry. The orc then gently placed the strawberry on top of a freshly made cake. He was visibly disgusted, unable to believe that the orc had been the one making strawberry cakes. Marie laughed and told him that, despite the chief's appearance, his skills were top-notch. The chief then asked what brought him to the kitchen. He replied that he was there to bake some cookies. Marie asked why he was making cookies, and he explained that he wanted to give them to someone. Her eyes teared up as she stepped closer, asking if it was a woman other than her. He shouted that it wasn't what she thought, though technically it was for a woman. Marie, still sulking, helped him put on an apron while he rolled up his sleeves. The chief offered to bake the cookies for him, but he declined, saying that making heartfelt snacks with his own hands was what truly mattered. He proudly told them that he might not look it, but cookies were his specialty. Just then, a red liquid splashed across his face. Turning in horror, he saw two other chief orcs smashing strawberries, so violently it looked like a bloodbath. Screaming, he asked if they were sure they hadn't added actual blood to the strawberry juice. Marie only laughed in response. A moment later, he rushed to Marion, who was preparing to leave. She asked him what the matter was, and he told her he had heard she was leaving and had come to say goodbye. She smiled and said she appreciated it, adding that he must be tired from yesterday's duel. He replied that he wasn't, then handed her a small box. Opening it, she found cookies inside. Clearing her throat, she shyly told him that he really didn't have to prepare a gift. He responded that he was simply happy to see her again and couldn't help but make something. Radon then recalled Chris asking him if there were any particular foods Marion liked, and realized that must have been the reason Chris had been searching for him the day before. He thought to himself that Chris really did know how to win someone over. Chris urged Marion to try one, proudly claiming he had baked them himself. She asked if that was really true, and he confirmed it. She took a cookie and tasted it, quickly realizing it was delicious, but she composed herself and calmly told him it was very tasty. He replied that he was glad she liked them. Marion then told him she ought to give him something in return for such a fine gift, and asked if there was anything he wished for. Smiling, He told her that he wished for her to become his true aunt from now on. She was startled and said that since they were already related by blood, there had to be a deeper meaning behind his words. She asked if it was true that he was participating in the sacred dark rite, as Radon had mentioned. He nodded in response. She concluded that he must be hoping to gain her support in the upcoming succession conflict. However, she explained that adults from the main family were required to remain impartial toward the candidates. That was the rule. He clarified that he was simply making a sincere request. He just wanted to become closer to her. She called it absurd and asked if he truly had no ulterior motive. He assured her he didn't, and that if she were to secretly offer her support out of affection, he would reject it. He then gave her a long stare with puppy eyes. Laughing, she told him she didn't dislike his honesty. Since her nephew had baked such delicious cookies and gifted them to her, she couldn't help but cherish him. He thanked her warmly. Marion then asked if she could have more tasty cookies next time. He replied that it would depend on her. Curious, she asked what he meant. He told her that if she made him sad, he might sulk and be unable to recreate the taste. He then gave her 2 finger hearts and asked if she understood. She sighed and, turning serious, asked what he thought about joining the Black Shadow Knights. He was about to reply when she interrupted, stating that he had been exceptional in the duel against Melon, and might even be a greater prodigy than the Elder Clan head. However, his rivals would not be easy opponents, and she worried that he might wither away before his talent had the chance to bloom. He responded confidently that if he failed to climb the mountains in his way, he wouldn't mind dying. He appreciated her concern, but didn't believe he would lose. She found his confidence unreasonable, but for some reason she smiled, thinking that if it was Chris, maybe it was possible. She agreed, and said she wouldn't stop him from walking a bloody path, because he was a fiend after all, but she asked to offer one piece of advice. Leaping onto her horse, cookie box in hand, she warned him to be wary of the first young lady. Radon asked why they should be wary of Julianne and not Eschid. Wasn't Julianne the most gentle of the 5 young lords? Marion simply replied that they would come to understand soon enough. Chris thanked her for the advice and promised to keep it in mind. She turned her horse and told him she would see him next time. A moment later, he lay back in bed, lost in thought. Both his father and aunt had reached the 6-star level, yet he hadn't heard much about their roles in the Great War. It made him wonder just how many powerful combatants existed in the Magic Empire. He guessed there were likely enough to overwhelm the Dominion of Light, at the very least. Still, he didn't want his past to repeat itself, and reminded himself that he needed to grow stronger, faster. A month later, he entered Radon's office and asked if he had called for him. Radon replied yes. There was something important he needed to tell him. But when Radon looked up and saw him, he was shocked to discover that Chris had already reached 2-star rank. Radon could hardly believe that Chris had achieved such growth in only a month. But Chris simply shrugged and reminded him that he had promised, so he shouldn't be surprised. He then asked what Radon wanted to talk about, especially at such an hour, and Radon replied that he had received word from the main family. Radon explained that he had submitted both Chris and Thurn as candidates for the Sacred Dark Rite, but only Thurn had been approved. The reason, he said, was Chris's frivolous spending, lecherous womanizing, drunken destruction of property, and even thievery, all of which, unfortunately, were true. Chris felt each word like a blow and fell to the ground, dramatically overwhelmed by the truth of his own actions. Radon, however, was furious. He shouted, demanding to know how they dared to look down on his son. He then asked Radon if Viscount Langham had been the one behind the decision, but Radon shook his head. Langham, he explained, had little to say after Eschid's recent misconduct. The real issue, he added, was Loin de Barin, something Chris had expected. Loin was a direct descendant of the main family and the frontrunner in the upcoming Sacred Dark Rite. The rite itself was a ritual where candidates absorbed pure darkness from the negative dimension. Since the amount of darkness was limited, the candidates were forced into a quasi-deathmatch to establish a hierarchy. Those who ranked higher would absorb more darkness, gaining a critical advantage in the selection of the next young lord, the successor of the clan. Chris knew that if Loin dominated the ritual and monopolized the darkness, his dream of becoming the 6th young lord would become much harder to achieve. Radon reassured him not to worry, promising to speak to the main family again, and, if necessary, to request Marion's help. But Chris declined, saying it wasn't necessary, and that he would figure things out on his own. Radon placed a hand on his son's shoulder, telling him that he recognized his talent and that he had indeed changed, but that this was a matter the adults could handle. Chris smiled softly at his father's words and replied that he appreciated the sentiment, but he had his own methods. Seeing that smile, Radon became suspicious. He was sure Chris was already plotting something. All he could do was ask if Chris already had an idea. Chris asked Radon if any children from Count Tiramin's household would be participating among the branch families. Radon confirmed that Tiramin's 3rd son would be there. Immediately angered, Radon shouted that Count Tiramin was a scoundrel who sided with Loan and had no right to participate in the Sacred Dark Rite. He ranted that Tiramin was merely a trickster who only knew how to control demon beasts. Chris, surprised by Radon's uncharacteristic outburst, realized just how doting his father could be. He calmly told Radon to settle down and explained that he simply needed to prove himself. He already knew the Tiramin family would be hosting a black pill hunt soon, and planned to participate as a herder. Meanwhile, in the clan head's castle, Marion reported to the clan head that she had personally checked on Christian, as ordered. The clan head asked how the boy was, and she replied that Chris was now incomparable to others. Still, the clan head found it hard to believe. The child he remembered had been a brat who thought himself a genius, when in reality, he was nothing but a false prodigy. Marion assured him that Chris was clearly different now. The clan head asked if she believed he could fulfill the long-desired wish, the very reason the clan head had continued to live, even using heaven-defying magic to delay death. Marion hesitated, knowing that her father's wish was the only thing keeping him alive. Finally, she answered that she couldn't say for certain, but Chris might be the closest to achieving it. This intrigued the clan head, who decided he should keep an eye on the boy. He then asked if it was true that Chris would be participating in the upcoming Sacred Dark Rite. Marion confirmed it was the general consensus within the clan. When she asked if he would intervene, the clan head shook his head and said he couldn't act over such a trivial matter. How could one call themselves a fierce beast, he asked, if they can't even overcome such a small trial? Startled by his words, Marion reminded him that while Chris might be a fierce beast, he was still a child. She believed Chris should at least be given the opportunity to receive darkness and awaken his potential. But the clan head simply glared at her, silencing her immediately. She looked away, unable to speak further. Marion knew that the clan head had always been that kind of man, harsher to those in whom he held high expectations. The clan head then told her that since she was willing to go so far, she must have truly taken a liking to Chris. He then summoned a blood drinker fiend, and a man appeared instantly before him, Simon, the head butler of the Dark Magic clan. Simon bowed and asked if the clan head had called for him. The clan head responded by asking if Simon had heard what was said, to which Simon replied yes, but asked if he was merely to observe that little bastard Christian. The clan head confirmed and ordered Simon to report everything Chris did leading up to the Sacred Dark Rite. Simon nodded and said he understood and would carry out the command. Then, Simon asked if he could pull a small prank during his monitoring, which startled Marion. The clan head gave him a sharp glare, but ultimately agreed, warning him not to go overboard. Simon grinned with excitement and immediately departed on his mission. Marion closed her eyes and silently hoped that Chris would make it through safely. Meanwhile, during the journey, Chris sat inside the carriage, deep in thought. He knew he had managed to reach 2-star rank quickly, thanks to his talent. However, despite all his training, his stamina and dark energy reserves were still insufficient. As he was now, reaching 3-star was impossible. He realized he needed a black pill to rapidly accumulate dark energy in a short period of time. He wondered if the black pill hunt, hosted by the Tiraman family, was truly coincidental or simply a scheme to provoke him. Either way, he considered it a stroke of luck. The problem, however, was that capturing the demon beast, Karajov, didn't automatically earn a black pill. He would need to meet special conditions. The carriage came to a stop. Outside, Grantel greeted them with a worried expression and asked what brought Chris there. Chris casually asked how Grantel had been, and whether he had come empty-handed. Grantel was startled by the question, but quickly replied that he hadn't. He produced a money bag and insisted that he would never greet him without a gift. Chris, unimpressed, slapped the bag away, letting it slam to the ground. Grantel stared at him, confused and surprised. Chris then asked him why he would bring such a pathetic gift and told him that he clearly didn't understand his place. Fuming, Chris accused Grantel of engaging in illegal activities and asked whether evading casino taxes was proving profitable. He also demanded to know how the items Grantel had swindled from the Merchant Guild were doing, and if he was still kidnapping people. Surrounded and defeated, Grantel shouted in desperation, asking what Chris wanted from him. Chris told him that he would let it slide this time, but warned him to cease all activities that crossed the line. Grantel nodded in agreement. Chris then told Grantel there was something he needed, an ash pill. Grantel trembled, knowing that ash pills had recently surged in price on the black market. Chris patted him on the head and said he understood the situation. He then turned to Marie behind him and asked if she was ready. Laughing, Marie transformed into her devil form, revealing 2 sharp knives, and declared that her torture skills were super. Grantel screamed in fear, immediately dropped to his knees, and shouted that he would procure the ash pill right away. Chris smiled and asked if things weren't so much easier when Grantel cooperated. He then winked and added that while Grantel was at it, he should also get him a dagger sharp enough to cut through armor, leaving Grantel utterly confused. Stepping back into the carriage, Chris bid farewell to Grantel. As they rode away, Grantel slammed his forehead into the ground and cursed him loudly. Marie asked if they were heading home now, but Chris replied no. He had one more place to visit. Soon, they stopped in front of a potion shop. Chris instructed the coachman to halt and then entered the store with Marie. He looked around, scanned the shelves, and pointed to one in particular. The shopkeeper retrieved the item and placed it on the table. Marie peered at the potion and asked what it was for. Chris calmly replied that he had a use for it. Still confused, she asked what possible use he could have for an aphrodisiac, a potion known to increase sexual desire. Marie stared at him suspiciously, causing him to sweat nervously. She then teasingly asked if he was already tempted, and he immediately denied it. Still, she assured him that it was okay. She understood him. This irritated him, prompting him to shout that it wasn't what she thought and that the potion wasn't for him, it was for someone else. She narrowed her eyes and seriously asked if it could be for Radon. He nodded and explained that, considering his father's age, he needed to make sure to take care of him. The shop owner was visibly startled. Chris then turned to him and shouted that, for the Count's honor, he absolutely must keep it a secret. The owner nervously replied that he would be very careful. The next day, Thurn and Radon came out to see him off. Thurn called him brother, but he immediately reminded Thurn of his proper title. Trembling, Thurn corrected himself and called him Honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother, then calmed down and said he had heard the black pill hunt was dangerous and told him to be careful not to get hurt. Teasingly, Chris asked if Thurn was worrying about him. Thurn, flustered, explained that he was just concerned that they wouldn't have a proper duel. Radon interrupted them, telling them to stop their siblings squabbling and instructed Chris to make sure to flatten those arrogant Tiraman bastards' noses. Chris confidently responded that he would and promised to return with refreshing news. Radon then turned to Thurn and asked what the King Emperor title meant, startling Thurn, who quickly replied that Radon didn't need to know. Later at the house of Count Tiraman, the butler once again informed them that they were not allowed entry into the Count's mansion. His servants, furious, demanded to know how the butler dared to say such a thing after making them wait all this time and whether he even knew who they were accompanying. The butler, unfazed, explained that it was Alois's order and stated plainly that Alois had no favor to repay to a good-for-nothing bastard. Chris glared at the butler and asked if he really dared to imply that he should find his own accommodations, causing the butler to flinch. Yet the man reluctantly confirmed that, yes, that was the case. One of Chris's servants angrily asked for permission to behead the butler on the spot, but Chris held him back and calmly asked what about the payment for alternative accommodations. The butler stammered and replied that they could send the bill to Count Tyraman. Smirking, Chris agreed to find his own lodging. A short while later, they arrived at a grand mansion with a central fountain and golden exterior details. It was an enormous and luxurious hotel. One of the servants asked how much the place would cost, and another replied that it would be at least 100,000 rupees. Chris simply said that it wasn't often they could spend someone else's money so freely, and told them they had 1 hour to organize their luggage. After that, they would go out to drink. Suddenly, one of the luggage bags moved. He turned toward it after hearing a sound. From inside the bag, he saw a blue glow. Marie suddenly burst out from the luggage, beaming with excitement. She enthusiastically exclaimed that the mansion in front of them was super, and it looked perfect for serving him. Shocked, he demanded to know why she was there. She cheerfully explained that she had hidden inside his luggage because she had promised to be his maid forever. He simply sighed, rendered speechless by her unexpected appearance. Marie laughed, telling him that the way he was acting, shy and flustered, was simply adorable, and that his expression clearly showed how much he missed her. He was about to deny it in disgust when suddenly someone rudely called out to him. It was Alois, the third son of Count Tyraman, who shouted at him, demanding an explanation for the outrageous bill. Chris figured that Alois would start using informal language right away. He asked in return if this wasn't the protagonist of the Black Pill hunt. Then, he reminded Alois that he had been the one to tell him to find his own place to stay. And so, he had. Was there a problem? He added that, as an honored guest, there was no way he could stay in a mere hotel, so he went ahead and purchased a passable mansion instead. Then, with a smirk, he asked if Alois was really throwing a tantrum over such a small amount of money. Chris went on to say that, considering how pathetic Alois was, someone who didn't even know how to treat a guest properly, the amount was actually a cheap price for a valuable lesson in manners. Infuriated, Alois crumpled the receipt in his hand and released his dark power, summoning his pet beast. With venom in his voice, he asked Chris if he really wanted to die. Chris recognized the technique immediately. It was Count Tyraman's subjugation arts, a forbidden dark magic method distinct from the Alliance's beast taming. Subjugation arts manipulated demon beasts through fear, injecting secret formulas that triggered hallucinations, paranoia, and unnatural excitement. Still, it seemed more complex than expected, and Chris realized it would be difficult to fully grasp the technique in a short amount of time. So instead, he considered whether he should just beat the living hell out of it for now. Turning to Marie, he asked if he was right in thinking that exterminating that scary kitty would require a weapon. Laughing, Marie pulled out a simple piece of wood and handed it to him as his weapon. He grinned and teasingly asked Alois what he was doing. Wasn't he going to come at him like a real fiend? Alois shouted back not to order him around, calling him a good-for-nothing bastard. Then he ordered his pet to attack. The beast lunged at Chris, jaws wide open. Chris blocked it with the wooden stick, but the beast's sharp teeth cracked the wood and flung him away with force. He tumbled across the ground, sat up quickly, and said the pet wasn't too shabby, but asked if 2 versus 1 wasn't a little unfair. Then he raised the stakes. If he won, Alois would have to participate in the hunt as a guard instead of a mere herder. After all, it needed to be at least that dramatic to make ends meet. Chris called Alois a cheap fiend, and asked what he thought of the deal. Infuriated, Alois jumped behind his pet, shouted "cocky son of a bitch," and charged forward with his beast, swearing to make Chris kneel. Alois commanded the creature to raise its claw and slam it into the ground. The impact shattered the ground, but when the dust cleared, Chris was nowhere to be seen. Alois blinked in confusion, asking where he had gone, unaware that Chris was now behind him. With a dramatic swing, Chris slammed the wooden stick into the back of Alois's head, then repeatedly struck him before landing on the ground, rolling the stick playfully in his hand. He asked Alois if it hurt, but warned him not to cry, because he wouldn't go easy on him just because of a few tears. Alois shouted in rage, dashing toward Chris again. But before he could strike, a grim reaper appeared behind him, startling his pet, which hissed in terror and bolted, hiding behind the luggage. Alois, now trembling, demanded to know how Chris dared to scare his pet Shoko. Chris casually explained that he had used a simple 2-star illusion spell, and apparently that alone was too much for Alois's pathetic subjugation arts to handle. Alois screamed at him to shut up and began casting another spell. When Chris noticed that Alois was summoning his horse demon this time, he called out and asked if he knew what the trait of a trash-tier bastard was. Alois growled and asked what. Chris didn't answer with words. Instead, he hurled the wooden stick, striking Alois squarely in the forehead. Alois collapsed on the ground, unconscious. Chris looked down at him and commented that not waiting for a transformation or spell to finish casting. That was the real trait of trash-tier fools. Alois's summon fizzled out, half-finished and fading. Later, he was busy gambling when his servant asked him worriedly if he was sure he could do it, and he replied that there was plenty of time, so he should rest while he could. Yet, his servant informed him that he wasn't really resting right now. He angrily asked what was wrong with a good-for-nothing guy playing like a good-for-nothing guy should, and asked Marie if he was right. Marie laughingly agreed with him and assured the servants that everything was okay, as long as Chris didn't drink alcohol. She then gave him ginger ale juice. He was frustrated upon seeing it because he wanted alcohol and was sad that he couldn't have any, while Alois's butlers stood guard from the side, wondering why Alois wanted them to keep an eye on such a bastard. He then asked Alois's butlers if they wanted to join them at the table, and told them he was sure their master wouldn't wake up until tomorrow since he had beaten him to a pulp. He then winked at them and assured them he would keep it a secret if they joined, which pissed the butlers off even more. They replied that there was no need for them to join him and that he should mind his own business. He teasingly agreed and told them to have fun watching him. Hours later, when the sun was about to set, he shouted lively to his servants to deal the cards and drink his share of the alcohol. His servant replied that he wouldn't go easy on him this time. More hours passed, and the dark sky appeared. Alois's butlers were disgusted watching him and his servants sleeping on the table in exhaustion and drunkenness, making them think that it was pointless to keep watch any longer and that they should just go make a short report. He then woke up when he heard the butlers leave the room. He immediately sat up and looked out the window to check if the servants were gone. He was annoyed because it had gotten late and he knew he should get moving. He then gave his coat to Marie and took his outer coat from his bag, telling her that he needed to go somewhere real quick so she shouldn't follow him. But Marie just stared at him and asked if she was right that there was an aphrodisiac in his bag, making him stop walking. She then told him that she knew it wasn't for the Count but for him to use, which shocked him. She added that she was sad to be unable to attend him in bed, but she would cheer for his nighttime activities. He shouted at her in anger that she sure loved running her mouth. A moment later, in the Katon Mountain, he was looking around and was amazed to see the secret land of Count Tiramin's house. He noticed that the energy of demon beasts was very dense there, just as its reputation suggested. He then walked quietly, knowing that he should be reaching the hunting ground soon. As he expected, he saw the hunting ground, but was surprised that there were only 2 guards. He then slowly turned himself invisible and was glad he had learned the invisibility spell from Marie. He remembered asking Marie to teach him, and she teasingly asked what he planned to do with invisibility magic, making him ask her back why she always interpreted things like that. He then easily walked past the guards without them noticing and entered the hunting ground. Minutes later, he saw a stage and rushed to it, wondering if it was the altar where they would hold the finale of the Black Pill hunt, because it was as eerie as they said. He then remembered his past friend telling him that he must make a Karajoff offer its life to him to obtain a black pill. In other words, he must make it so terrified that it would rather die instead. His friend added that just as opposites are connected, intense fear and radiant joy are on the same spectrum. So, in that short moment, the useless ash pill is reborn as the black pill. This is why the House of Count Tiramin, which specializes in dominating demon beasts through fear, is the one leading the black pill hunt. He smiled upon remembering it and understood that, as Lena mentioned, he was planning to steal the Tiramin's ultimate technique. Let the Karajoff run wild after giving it the aphrodisiac mixed with various substances and monopolize the black pill for himself. But he knew there was not enough time to steal their technique and learn it, so he needed to find another way. Suddenly, he felt a strong magical power behind him, making him look back, wondering if someone was there. He then heard something a short distance away and stood up. He turned toward the noise and ran toward it at full speed. He saw a nearby cave and was surprised to see it. He then carefully entered the cave, but immediately smelled intense malice and noticed the presence of top barrier dark magic inside. He then wondered if it was a crevice of Gehenna, the world of demons. Chris couldn't believe that there was a crevice linking it with the human world right there. He then had an idea and wondered if he should lure the Karajoff over there since he had the aphrodisiac to bait it. He tightly held the potion and felt excited for the hunt. He then walked out of the cave, not noticing a red bat in the middle of the cave watching him. The bat extended its wings and Simon turned back to his human form. He didn't expect the little bastard to be so interesting. Simon saw that not only did he pummel the Tiramin brat, but he even made his observers let their guard down by acting like a good-for-nothing and secretly entering forbidden areas, clearly scheming something. Simon was then excited because Chris made him want to play an even more terrible prank on him. Simon approached the crevice and put his hand inside it, which caused it to bleed. Simon's blood dripped into the magical barrier on the ground, which dissolved into smoke, and a voice called Simon Defiler and asked him what his wish was, while Simon smiled maliciously in excitement. The next morning, Alois proudly pierced the flagstick into the ground and raised it with his servants and Chris. But then Chris teasingly asked Alois if he thought he was acting cool for someone who got his ass whooped by him, making Alois shout at him to shut it and call him a poser. Alois then asked him why he brought a grenade when he couldn't even use it, and he replied that it was more effective than a club. He then asked if Alois wanted a taste of it, making Alois tremble in fear. Alois then called the herders and ordered them to lure the Karajoff to the altar, to which they replied yes. Alois then ordered the fiends assigned to guard duty to follow him because they would be standing by at the altar, and they also replied yes. Chris then noticed the red bat hanging in the tree above them, but before he could react, Alois shouted at him to answer. He teasingly replied yes. They then arrived at the altar, and the guard told him to go hole up to the side because he would only get in the way of the hunt. He replied that it was fine with him if he got to laze around, but warned the guard not to come crying to him later for help with the cleanup when they sheet the bed, making the guard rage and call him an asshole. But then, Alois stopped the guard and told him not to tire himself out before the hunt had even begun. Alois then called him a good-for-nothing and ordered him to go stand by and guard the flag, to which he teasingly replied yes, saying that the good-for-nothing would dutifully protect the flag. He then leaned against a tree while guarding the flag and decided to watch them try their hardest. He was confident they would just be playing into his trap, and had made sure to pack the dagger and the ash pill poor Grantel had given him. Suddenly they heard something huge approaching, and he knew it was coming. Karajoff, a 4-magic demon beast, was being dragged toward the altar. But then it lovingly stared at him, making him wonder why it looked so derpy. The guard then asked Alois if he was ready, and told him to begin the subjugation art. Alois walked forward in response and activated his subjugation art's magic circle. He then began his spell on the Karajoff while the herders held it in place. But then the Karajov smelled the aphrodisiac potion on the ground and was instantly affected by it. It lost control, shocking and confusing Alois, but before he could react, the Karajov pushed him away. The guard immediately rushed to Alois to ask if he was alright as the Karajov rampaged. It released poison into the air, and the herders rushed into a defensive formation. Chris saw them protecting Alois with all their might while the Karajov tried to break through their defense, and he knew it wouldn't work because the Karajov was out of control due to the aphrodisiac. Alois knew that they had consumed some antidote ahead of time, but it would still be dangerous if it dragged on. The servants immediately covered their noses and mouths to avoid inhaling the poison and tried their best to stop the Karajov, but it was too strong and easily threw them aside. The Karajov then tilted its head and swung it down toward Alois, but luckily for him, someone managed to block it in time, and Alois was shocked to see that it was Chris. Struggling to hold back the Karajov using the grenade, Chris told Alois that the house of Count Tiraman was quite pathetic, forcing the busy flag bearer to step in. He then teasingly told Alois that he would be nice and bail him out if he promised to call him Big Brother. Alois called him a crazy asshole and asked why he would do that, but Chris just asked him back what he planned to do and reminded him they didn't have all the time in the world. Alois looked at his servants, who were struggling to breathe from the poison, and clenched his teeth while trembling. He then furiously called Chris a fucking bastard but asked for his help. Chris agreed but reminded Alois to keep his promise. He then forcefully pushed the Karajov's head away using the grenade and cast the subjugation art spell. Chains came out from his magic and wrapped around the Karajov's head and body. Alois was shocked to see him using subjugation arts, but Chris just called him a country bumpkin for being surprised and asked if he thought they were the only ones who could use it, knowing that as long as it wasn't a secret technique, something like intermediate subjugation art was no big deal. He then forcefully pulled the chain to the side and held it tightly. He jumped behind the Karajov while pulling the chain on its head upward, making it turn to the side. He then controlled it to run off in that direction, making Alois shout after him in panic, telling him to stop. They were heading toward the crevice. But Chris just smirked at Alois in response and kept going. Just minutes later, he arrived at the cave with the Karajov and pulled the chain to stop it. The Karajov then saw the dark magic barrier around the cave and screamed in fear, but Chris calmly asked if it was its first time seeing the malice of Gehenna, and teasingly told it to be terrified. From the overwhelming pain and fear, the Karajov stopped screaming and its eyes transformed into a black pill. Chris immediately grabbed the dagger from behind his back and stabbed the Karajov's eye, then began slashing at its head to extract the eye. A moment later, Alois and the others arrived at the cave and worriedly asked Chris if he was okay. Alois then told him that it was an extremely dangerous cave and they needed to hurry out, yet Chris just told him not to be such a wimp and asked what they should do. He then showed them the pill and told them it turned out to be an ash pill, not a black pill, which surprised all of them. Alois bit his lip in frustration, and his servant angrily asked what they were going to do about it, shouting that if Alois hadn't intervened, it wouldn't have happened. But Alois ordered them to leave it, and shyly thanked Chris for rescuing his subordinates, admitting that they managed to finish without any major injuries thanks to him. This startled Chris because he didn't expect it from Alois. He then felt a bit bad, and it made him feel even worse knowing that he had swapped out the black pill. But he reminded himself that he should do what he must. He then teasingly told Alois to call him Big Brother because he promised, which shocked Alois. Chris asked if he was going back on his word, and Alois replied that he never made such a promise, and that he was 2 years older than him. Suddenly, the cave shook and released a strong force that shocked all of them. The servants were down on the ground because they couldn't withstand the pressure, but Alois and Chris remained standing. Alois asked him what was going on, but Chris stayed silent and looked back. He then saw a huge demon with blue, shining eyes glaring at them, which terrified him. The demon told them it had been a while since it had seen a plaything, and Chris immediately knew it was a demon from Gehenna. Alois stepped in front of him, stutteringly telling him to run away since he was an outsider and should save himself. Yet Chris remained quiet and noticed the same bat from earlier at the side. He rolled the dagger tip in his hand and threw it in the bat's direction. He hit it successfully, but it turned into ashes and returned to Simon, who was shocked while watching from the portal. Simon wondered when Chris had noticed him and thought he would stop the demon after observing a bit, but now that the bat clone he had planned to use for teleportation was gone, it would take him at least 5 minutes to get there, even if he used blood magic to its limits. Simon knew that if he arrived too late, everyone would die. He then immediately rushed toward the cave at top speed. Meanwhile, in the cave, the demon told Chris that he was interesting and asked what he was scheming. Chris simply smiled and replied that he just didn't like it when someone tried to sneak peeks at him, making the demon laugh and say he sure had a lot of concerns for a dead man. Chris looked at the four-armed demon and figured that, compared to the demons he faced during the Age of Destruction, this one was low ranking. Still, it was at least a 5-star demon, not someone he could face head-on right now. Yet he raised a finger and spread sleeping smoke, causing Alois's guards to instantly fall into deep sleep. Alois shouted, asking what he was doing and why he was putting them to sleep when they needed to fight together. Chris sighed in frustration, realizing that Alois had a strong resistance to magic. He then punched Alois in the abdomen while telling him to stop talking and go to sleep. Alois collapsed to the ground, unconscious. The demon was confused by his actions and asked if he intended to offer the others as sacrifices. The demon then agreed to spare Chris's life and even bless him in exchange for the humans. But Chris simply told it that it talked too much and uncovered Grenade, aiming it at the demon while stating that it was his principle not to associate with their kind. The demon recognized Grenade and aimed its hand at Chris, gathering magic power. It told him the idea was commendable, but a holy sword he couldn't use was merely a piece of junk. The demon then released the magic power at him. Chris blocked it with Grenade, but the force was too strong, and he was slammed into the wall. The demon grabbed him and said it would give him one chance. Offer them, and it would spare his insignificant life. Chris just spat in the demon's face, enraging it even more. He then teasingly asked who said he couldn't use the holy sword. He swung Grenade at the demon's hand, freeing himself. He let himself fall through the air and rolled as he hit the ground. He then released his light magic, triggering Grenade's holy power. The demon was shocked upon seeing it and asked how a fiend like him could use the power of light. But Chris just asked it back if it was finally feeling like its life was in danger. That infuriated the demon even more, and it put its hands together to gather stronger magic while shouting that it would slaughter him. It then hurled an even more powerful attack at Chris, but he calmly braced himself and activated the Dead Sea Cleaving Light technique. A brilliant slash of light cut through the demon's dark magic and shot toward it. The demon couldn't believe what it was seeing as the light slashed it in half, instantly killing it. Chris, panting, watched his breath fog and saw everything around him blur, realizing he had pushed his body too hard. He then collapsed to the ground, slowly losing consciousness. As he drifted off, he remembered Evan's shocked voice, asking if he had seen the Dead Sea Cleaving Light and managed to replicate it. He replied that it was something like that and demonstrated it to Evan. Evan shook his head in disbelief, saying Chris was really something. He then explained that the Dead Sea Cleaving Light literally represented the single flash of light that divides the Dead Sea. But ironically, even with that sword technique, Evan had failed to become the light of the Meyer clan. He then told Chris that he surely would become the light that would save the world. A gentle being then touched Chris's head and thought he was interesting. She introduced herself as Mefina, a first seat of Gehenna's 7th realm, while Tiramin's people arrived to rescue them. Chris let his eyes close while Mefina whispered that she looked forward to his future actions. Days later, in the manor of Count Tiramin, he was in his room, feeling his head hurt, and couldn't believe he had just laid there for 2 whole days. He checked his body and noticed that it was fine. Then, he remembered the black pill and was glad to see that it was still there. He immediately took the bag from his bedside table and sighed in relief upon seeing the black pill inside. He then remembered Mefina and figured that he had received some unwanted attention. He knew that occasionally, fiends who stand out early receive a demon's blessing and can be nurtured quickly. But he asked himself why he should care when that was something bad guys received. He then thought that a 7th world demon wouldn't even be that high level. Someone knocked on his door and Count Tiramin, the patriarch of House Tiramin, walked in together with Alois. The Count said he heard he had woken up and asked how his body was doing. Chris immediately rose out of bed to greet the Count, but Count Tiramin told him it was all right and that he shouldn't get up. Just listen. He sat back down and looked at Count Tiramin in confusion. Count Tiramin then informed him that they had organized an investigation squad and checked the cave yesterday. They found that someone had tampered with the magic circle that sealed the entrance to Gehenna. Fortunately, it seemed the Demonkin had been reverse summoned in the meantime. But no matter how fleeting the moment was, it had still been more than enough time for everyone to lose their lives. He responded that he understood, all the while wondering if they truly believed it was a reverse summon. He thought that made sense. It would be difficult for them to even consider that he had extinguished it himself. Since he didn't need to come up with an excuse, it was a gain for him. Count Tiramin then said he would begin with an apology. He apologized for treating him poorly, relying only on rumors of him being a good-for-nothing, and respectfully thanked him as a benefactor of House Tiramin. This startled Chris. He told Count Tiramin that it wasn't like that, and as a member of a dark magic clan, he had simply done what he needed to. After all, they were family. But the truth was, he had decided to muddy the waters even though it hurt his conscience. Because if he couldn't obtain the black pill, he would simply sneak it out. Count Tiramin thought for a moment upon hearing the word family, and told him that if there was anything he could help him with, he should say so. As long as it wasn't something impossible, he would make sure it happened. Chris responded that if that was the case, he hoped House Tiramin would shake off the old grudges against House Khazar, which surprised Count Tiramin. He added that instead of the current enemy-like relationship, where they kept baring their fangs at each other, he wished they could have a friendly but competitive relationship, one where they could plan for proper advancements together, something that matched the fact that they were bloodline kin. Count Tiramin hesitated to agree, but Chris told him that he surely also knew the real reason their 2 houses were feuding, the behind-the-scenes manipulation of the main clan. If the branch families worked together, the main clan might feel threatened. This meant it was a scheme to keep them as mere dogs guarding the house. Count Tiramin asked him if he was suggesting a revolt against the main clan, but Chris replied that he had no such thoughts whatsoever. He simply believed that they shouldn't be pushed around because of something the main clan did wrong. Count Tiramin told him that he was deep, and he couldn't believe Chris thought so far ahead. Chris thanked the Count for his praise and asked if he would accept the request. Count Tiramin sighed and replied that, for the first time in a while, he should contact that punk Ridan, making Chris smile, knowing that if they could just unite their forces like this, they could establish a much firmer front during the Age of Destruction. Count Tiramin then hit Alois while asking him what he was just watching for, and reminded him that he said he also had something to say. Alois cleared his throat and shyly handed the ash pill to him. Alois then explained that when he came into the cave, the ash pill was on the floor, and since Chris showed no signs of waking up, he made sure to take care of it. Chris accepted the ash pill, but teasingly told Alois that if it happened to be that he was so grateful he wanted to give him more things, he could give him as many as he wanted, which pissed Alois off. Count Tiramin laughed upon seeing them, and told Chris that, as he said, since he was so grateful, he would give him a gift. Count Tiramin then handed him a summoning stone that could store up to a rank 4 demon beast. Chris was surprised to see it, knowing that it was an incredibly rare item, but Count Tiramin wasn't finished, and informed him that he would make a report so that Chris could participate in the sacred dark rite. Count Tiramin then wished him good results, and Chris thanked him for both the gift and the encouragement. Count Tiramin then turned around and walked out of the room with Alois to let him rest. Chris softly smiled at them, and once he was sure they were gone, he asked someone why they didn't come out now. A dark and red shadow then emerged from the curtain, and Simon revealed himself to Chris, saying that, as he expected, it wasn't a coincidence that Chris had discovered him. He couldn't believe Chris had seen through stealth that even Count Tiramin couldn't detect. Chris explained that he could smell the scent of blood, and Simon greeted him respectfully before introducing himself as the butler of the dark magic clan. Chris wondered if that meant Simon was the Elder Clan head's henchman, and where he had heard Simon's name before. Then he tightly gripped his hand, realizing that Simon was the master of the Blood Shadow Mages' leader. The Blood Shadow Mages did not differentiate between the Magic Empire and the Dominion of Light. They were a psychotic organization that reveled in indiscriminate slaughter and terrorism. Their leader was a fiend who had reached the height of 8-star power and, during the endgame of the Age of Destruction, reached 9-star and became the 10th Demon King. Chris couldn't even count how many times they had nearly died because of that leader. And now Simon stood before him, the blood and flesh of the Demon King of Carnage. Simon then told him he never imagined the young master of House Khazar would be that amazing, not only because he had managed to eliminate a demonkin, which startled Chris. Chris wondered how Simon knew, as he was certain he had taken care of the clone. Could it be that Simon had seen the Dead Sea cleaving light? He then told Simon that he had no idea what he was talking about. Simon understood he was playing dumb. Simon then explained that after going to the cave, even the demonkin's corpse had been completely annihilated, leaving no trace. He knew it wasn't a reverse summoning, and for it to be a complete vaporization inside the cave, he was impressed by Chris's skill, which surprised Chris. Simon then asked if he could explain how he did it, and informed him that what he said would be reported to the Elder Clan head. He could think of it as an evaluation, but Chris replied that he didn't understand why he needed to reveal his trump card. Simon was confused upon hearing this and repeated that it would be reported to the Elder. Yet Chris told Simon that if he were the Elder Clan head, he wouldn't want a little nerd who answered every question. He'd want a predator who kept their claws hidden until the very end. This startled Simon. Simon then smilingly told him that he was truly an interesting person, but Chris just asked him if he wasn't going to apologize. Simon asked back what he should apologize for. Chris replied that normally, it was difficult to differentiate between a reverse summoning and complete annihilation using just traces. That's why Count Tyraman misunderstood it to be a reverse summoning. However, Chris believed it was annihilation, and for him, the reasoning was simple once he thought about it. He then pointed at Simon and told him it was because he was the summoner himself. He also told Simon that this was a demonkin summoning case where a member of the clan almost died, and asked what would happen if news that Simon was the one who caused the mayhem were overheard by the Elder Clan head. Simon defeatedly agreed and said he would take responsibility. But Chris responded that they should keep it a secret, which confused Simon. Chris simply reminded him to remember that he owed him a big favor, which startled him. Simon then asked if this was a deal, and Chris replied that it would be great if that was how he chose to understand it. Simon laughingly replied that he understood, then activated his stealth while telling Chris that he wouldn't forget the mercy shown to him. He added that it was great meeting him today and hoped to see him soon, and that he would be counting down the days until Chris arrived at the main clan. Then Simon disappeared. Chris knew that Simon was someone who would have an important role to play during the Age of Destruction, so he absolutely needed to form a connection with him in order to change the future. The next day, his luggage floated in the air while he was busy fixing his tie. Marie, who was controlling the luggage, informed him that she had finished the preparations to return home, and he praised her for it. Someone then knocked. It was Alois, asking him if he was leaving now, but he simply told Alois to use his title, which surprised him. He then reminded Alois that he let it slide yesterday in front of the Count, but a promise was a promise, and from now on, he should always call him Big Brother, which pissed Alois off. Alois shouted that he was 2 years older than him. He then asked Alois if he had something he wanted to say. Alois replied that he came to warn him. Alois told him that since he had said they were all family, after hearing it, he felt it wasn't right to do this to family. Alois then warned him to be careful. He was sure Chris was already aware, but the one most opposed to his participation in the Sacred Dark Rite was Loin. Alois asked if he was right in thinking that Chris knew even among 2 stars, the gap between the main family and the branch families wasn't the same. He explained that the greatest elixirs, the ultimate techniques of the main family, the blessing of dark magic, and the starting line for direct descendants, all of it was much further ahead than where they, the branch families, began. That meant Chris was going to be easy pickings. But Chris just smiled and responded with a warning of his own. He told Alois not to participate in the upcoming Sacred Dark Rite, and explained that he was saying it for his own good, which shocked Alois. Alois then furiously shouted that even though Chris was saying it out of concern, he wasn't going to let him monopolize the pure dark energy. But Chris confidently told him to keep in mind that no matter who his opponent was, they would come to regret facing him in the Sacred Dark Rite. Alois, angry, called him an insolent brat, but Chris ignored him and told Marie that they should get going. He then teasingly patted Alois on the back, telling him to think long and hard about his warning so he wouldn't regret it later. Days later, they arrived at the house of Count Khazar, and Thurn was surprised to hear that he had left for the training cave immediately upon returning. The butler confirmed it and reported to Thurn that Chris had said he wished to train alone until the Sacred Dark Rite. Thurn immediately stepped out and saw him walking through the hallway. Thurn then called out, "Honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother," which caught his attention and made him look back. He saw Thurn rushing toward him and reminding him of his promise to duel once he returned. Chris was amazed to notice how much Thurn had grown in such a short time and wondered if Thurn had already reached mid-2 star, a quick progression. He asked Thurn if he wanted to duel now, but told him that he was busy and needed to train. Thurn disagreed, and Chris remembered that Thurn was also participating in the upcoming Sacred Dark Rite. He then told Thurn to wait for now. They could duel once he was done training, and he encouraged Thurn to train as well. Thurn made him promise not to push it back further and warned him to watch out, as it wouldn't be anything like before. Chris agreed and watched Thurn walk back to continue his training, thinking that Thurn was a stubborn brat. Then, he smiled, remembering someone else, realizing Thurn reminded him of her. A moment later, in the secret training grounds resting place, he stared at the black pill, knowing he had half a month left until the rite. He bit into the black pill, holding himself back from vomiting despite how bitter it was. After consuming the entire black pill, he lay down on the bed and closed his eyes to focus. He sensed that it was more turbulent than he expected, but then he saw a small light. Confused, he wondered if the light force he sensed was within the black pill, and whether the elation the Karajoff experienced upon death had become part of the pill. That made him realize why black pills were difficult for fiends to absorb, but he decided it was irrelevant to him. He gathered the black pill's power throughout his entire body. When he was done, only the light force remained. He knew that fiends would normally expel that energy with their teacher's help, but he didn't want to waste such a valuable force. He decided to take it into his light core instead. He then began the process, and the light energy traveled through his veins and strengthened his light core, which was next to his dark core. He opened his eyes as he felt the powerful light energy settle within him and eventually calm down once it was fully absorbed. Meanwhile, in a distant castle, a butler approached a lady to report on the investigation she had requested. He handed her a scroll while reporting that during the black pill hunt, there had been an incident involving a demon kin summoning, but that the boy had survived it. The butler apologized to the lady, explaining that the investigation had taken longer because he had to look into the incident as well. The lady accepted his apology and praised him for his good work. The butler then bowed respectfully and said he would take his leave if there were no further questions. She remained silent and opened the report, where Chris's picture was inside. The butler quietly exited and said his goodbye to Idaline. Half a month later, Thurn knocked on the resting room door to tell him that today was the promised day. He told Thurn to come in, which Thurn did, and saw him changing clothes. Thurn was then shocked when he looked back and saw his overflowing dark energy. Chris told Thurn that he had come first thing in the morning, and he must really be looking forward to getting pummeled. Thurn couldn't believe what he was seeing, knowing that Chris's dominating presence was leagues beyond what it had been half a month ago. But Thurn managed to stutteringly shout at him, not to make him laugh. Chris then teasingly told Thurn that if he was that desperate for a taste of his knuckle sandwich, he would grant his wish. But if Chris won, Thurn should give up on participating in the upcoming Sacred Dark Rite. That shocked Thurn even more, and he asked him what he was saying. Chris replied that, as he knew, the rite was a competition, and weaklings should stay out of it. Thurn was pissed upon hearing that. He took out his sword and aimed it at Chris, shouting for him to shut up and raise his own sword. Chris took the sword from the counter while telling Thurn that he was blind to the fact he was just showing him some brotherly concern. He then shifted his sword to his other hand and teasingly told Thurn that he guessed he needed to pound it into him until he understood. Thurn then jumped toward him with his sword raised. But just minutes later, Thurn was in a cast, severely injured, lying on a bed and unable to look at him out of embarrassment. Radon sighed and told him that he had gone overboard this time, because the healer said Thurn would need bed rest for half a month. Chris just looked away, guilty. Radon then guessed that Thurn would have no choice but to wait for the next rite, making Thurn shout in disagreement. Before Radon could say more, Chris asked if he could have a moment alone with Thurn. Radon agreed, but before leaving Thurn's room, he told them that he would let them talk it out, as brothers. Radon then left them alone. Chris asked Thurn what he was pouting for and told him not to be a whiny baby like those Alliance dummies. He reminded Thurn that he was the one who had asked for the fight. Thurn was hurt upon hearing that and asked if he truly disliked seeing him grow. Thurn then reminded him that he had mocked him, looked down on his achievements, and now had deliberately injured him so he couldn't participate in the Sacred Dark Rite. Chris sighed, knowing Thurn was going to cry at this rate, and told him that he thought they weren't on the same page. He explained that he did it in hopes of seeing him become stronger, and stronger for his own sake, which surprised Thurn. He also explained to Thurn that if he competed against him in the rite, he would forever lose his chance to obtain pure dark energy. He had to be rough with him because of how stubborn he could be. But most importantly, pure dark energy didn't suit him. Thurn asked what he meant by that, and Chris told him that he was best suited for dark gray energy. Just like how the power of light divides into various types, there are also a variety of dark energies. Pure dark energy is the highest attribute of all dark energies, and just below it is gray dark energy, a type especially suited for curse magic. He then asked Thurn if he hadn't found it easier to master curse magic than swordsmanship, making Thurn ask him back how he knew about it. Chris hesitated to answer, knowing he couldn't tell Thurn he had seen it in the future, and had to come up with a decent excuse. So he replied that he could tell just from sparring with him, because he had been fighting with everything he had as well. That surprised Thurn even more. He then explained to Thurn that if he absorbed pure dark energy before mastering gray dark energy, it could cause problems later when he tried to learn gray dark energy. It wouldn't be impossible, since pure dark energy was the higher attribute, but he would be impeded by its unique properties. He told Thurn that it would only slow him down, and he knew Thurn wanted to become stronger as quickly as possible. However, he urged him to think things over again before participating in the rite. It was his sincere advice to him as an older brother rooting for his younger brother's growth. He then gave the ash pill to Thurn as a gift. Thurn was shocked to see it and asked why he was giving him such a valuable item. But he simply replied that it was because Thurn was his little brother, and asked him what other reason he needed. The truth was, he had already consumed something better, so he no longer needed it. Thurn teared up upon accepting the gift and hearing his words. He then held the ash pill tightly and told him that if he was capable of changing like this, he wondered why he behaved like such an imbecile, even when their mother was on her deathbed, and asked if he knew how much heartache their mother had suffered because of him. He was speechless upon hearing it, and sat down next to Thurn, replying quietly that he hadn't understood back then. Days later, he arrived at the main clan castle. He stepped out of the carriage with his whole body aching, realizing he needed a good stretch, and asked how far they had traveled. He then asked if it would have killed them to open the warp gate, muttering that he couldn't believe they were being that petty. He warned them to just wait. Once he became clan head, everything would change. Suddenly, Marie lovingly called out to him and appeared at his side. She then told him her heart was fluttering, thinking it was a date between just the two of them. Yet he just reminded her that she didn't have a heart. He knew that since the main family limited him to bringing only one companion, he could only bring Marie, who was attached to him due to their pact. He then noticed other fiends whispering to one another while staring at him. Marie laughingly told him that he was already famous, which pissed him off. But the fiends were all shocked when they saw Simon, the head butler, personally greeting him, making them wonder why the head butler was welcoming a so-called good-for-nothing. Simon looked him over carefully and remarked that it had only been half a month, yet he had grown even more. But Chris just asked Simon if, as the Elder Clan head's aide, he didn't have anything better to do with his time. Simon replied that was nonsense. He was there on the Elder Clan head's orders. Simon then informed him that the Elder Clan head wanted to meet him personally, which surprised him. Simon smirked and winked at him, asking if he had been expecting it since he didn't seem surprised. Chris, annoyed by Simon's flirtatious tone, replied that he was super surprised, but Simon teasingly told him that's not what it looked like. A moment later, he arrived at the head clan's chamber, and Simon announced that he had brought him. The Elder Clan head praised Simon for doing a great job and remarked to Chris that it had been a while. He was then stunned in fear when he felt the dark energy of the head clan. He could barely stand under the pressure of the head clan's dominating presence. Chris couldn't believe that the head clan was exuding such overwhelming energy, despite knowing that someone of his level couldn't withstand it, and it pissed him to his core. Yet, he managed to address the head clan respectfully as Duke Baron, and greeted him. The head clan asked if he was not surprised by the sudden meeting, and he replied no, because he had expected to be summoned. The head clan asked why he had expected it, and Chris replied, because a new star has appeared in the clan. The head clan laughed in agreement and said that neither Marion nor Simon could hold back their compliments, but he couldn't quite tell yet if he should have any expectations. Chris remained quiet. The head clan then remarked that no matter how great the seed may be, only time would tell how it would grow in the future. It could be a sapling that withers away as soon as it sprouts above ground. Chris agreed, saying he was still too lacking to match the head clan's expectations. This prompted the head clan to ask if he was implying he wouldn't be able to match them in the future. Chris replied that only time would tell whether the sapling would surpass expectations and grow into a great tree, or perhaps even become an abnormality that casts a shadow over the great tree. He added that, at the very least, he knew he wouldn't disappoint him. The head clan was speechless upon hearing his answer and told him he should have high hopes for him. The head clan then dismissed him, and Chris bowed respectfully before leaving the room. Marion asked the head clan what he thought of Chris. The head clan replied that Chris had exceeded his expectations. However, because he held such great talent, his fate would be all the more turbulent. The head clan then asked Marion if she also knew that bloody winds were blowing toward the magic empire. Marion remained quiet in response, but the head clan assured her that a small hope had sprouted today, which surprised her. He then added that Chris might indeed be able to fulfill his long-desired wish. Later, on the eve of the Sacred Dark Rite, during the banquet, the host announced the arrival of Chris as the eldest son of Count Khazar. He proudly entered the banquet hall. He heard the guests whispering, asking why the Elder Clan head would meet with a fool like him and saying he looked like a gigolo. But he expected that. After all, he was too handsome not to draw attention, something Marie happily agreed with. He then saw a waiter serving drinks and asked if it was booze. The waiter replied yes, but when Chris tried to grab one, the waiter pulled it away and asked if he was underage. Instead, the waiter handed him ginger ale. Marie laughed with the waiter while Chris stood frozen in the middle, holding his ginger ale. He wanted to curse the lame fiends for not letting him have alcohol. But then he snapped to attention when the host announced the arrival of the young lords and ladies. The banquet doors opened, and the young lords and ladies entered proudly. At the front was Ashid de Barhan, the second young lord. Next to him was Julianne de Barhan, the first young lady. The third in line was Jupion de Baron, the second young lady. And last was the third young lord, Mysak de Baron. Chris noticed the absence of the first young lord, the madman, and wondered what Ashid would say to him, the victim of his little game, and the one whose reputation he had sullied. However, Chris was surprised when Ashid simply walked past him without a word. He was angry that Ashid wouldn't even look him in the eye after everything that had happened, making him feel like he was no better than an ant in Ashid's eyes. Yet Julianne softly lifted her skirt in a graceful greeting as she passed him. He stared as she walked by and remembered Marion's warning to be wary of the first young lady, but he didn't sense anything particularly off. He turned away, deciding he'd figure it out later. That today's reconnaissance was enough, and now it was time to prepare for the rite. Just then, someone appeared behind him and greeted him, surprising him. He turned back in irritation as the man introduced himself as Fowler, a summoner working for Luan. But Chris simply asked, "So what?" Fowler replied that he had heard someone unworthy would be participating in the Sacred Dark Rite. He expressed concern that an underqualified participant might cause an accident and sully the name of the Great Dark Clan. Chris angrily asked Fowler if he was calling him unqualified. Fowler replied that Chris would simply have to prove he wasn't. Chris then spotted someone on the balcony and confirmed it was Loin. He was pissed. Fowler, a decoy, stood before him while Loin watched from a safe distance. He thought that if Loin had a problem, he should step up himself. Chris placed his ginger ale on a nearby table and decided not to make a scene. They could have their heart-to-heart during the rite. He then told Fowler that he would prove himself, and that it sounded like barely an inconvenience. Chris ordered Fowler to show him his party tricks. Fowler looked confused and asked if they were really going to do this here. He reminded Chris that he was unarmed. Chris simply asked if Fowler expected him to need a weapon to face someone like him. This angered Fowler, who swore Chris would regret it. But Chris just shrugged and teasingly asked if he really would, and told him that actually he thought it would be Fowler who regretted it. Unbeknownst to him, he had already caught the attention of the two young ladies, especially Julianne. Just a few minutes later, everyone at the banquet was shocked to witness evil spirits attacking Fowler, while Chris sat calmly on one of the spirits and the rest were tending to him. The guests couldn't believe what they were seeing. Fowler had started by summoning evil spirits, but those very spirits instantly turned on their summoner with just a single gesture from Chris. It left everyone wondering how he had gained control so quickly. Chris then stood up and asked if Faur's actions were Loin's will. Teasingly, he added that it was unbecoming of a direct heir of the Dark Magic clan, and told Loin that if he had any grievances, he should have just challenged him to a duel. But Loin responded that the incident had nothing to do with him. Chris retorted that not even a fool would fall for that lie, but said he would believe him just this once. He turned around and walked away, telling Loin that they should meet again during the Sacred Dark Rite. Inside, he was pissed seeing the cowardice of Loin and swore to teach him some manners next time. The day of the Sacred Dark Rite arrived, and everyone was gathered seriously in the hall, except Chris, who yawned loudly. Alois asked him if he wasn't the slightest bit nervous, and reminded him that he had even caused a ruckus the day before. But Chris asked Alois back why he had come when he had warned him not to. That made Alois panic, asking how Chris could try to push back the Sacred Dark Rite, calling him a crazy punk. Suddenly, someone walked down the stage. It was Loin. Chris trembled in anger upon seeing him and wanted to shout something, but then someone addressed them all. The vice butler in charge of the main house introduced himself as Sebastian. Sebastian then slammed the tip of his staff onto the floor and told them he would now guide them to the sacred ground where the Sacred Dark Rite would take place. The palace revealed a hidden underground, and everyone was shocked to see it led underground. But Chris knew better. He suspected it was an illusory art, materializing in imaginary space. Sebastian stepped onto the ladder first, but in just a second, appeared far below, halfway down. This caused the others to panic and rush to follow him, realizing Sebastian was leaving them behind. A moment later, underground, they were doing their best to catch up with Sebastian. As they climbed a slope, someone asked if they hadn't gone underground. Why was there such a steep incline? But there was no time to complain as Sebastian urged them to hurry and warned them the ground wouldn't support them for long. As he said this, the ground behind them began to collapse and 2 challengers fell. The others panicked at the sight, but before they could fully react, Sebastian informed them that since they were late, he would now be speeding up. He rushed ahead again, and moments later, 2 more challengers fell as the path behind them gave way. Loin scoffed, thinking they were weaklings who couldn't even keep up. He was just about to deem them unworthy pests when Chris suddenly appeared beside him at full speed, completely unfazed, which shocked Loin. He wondered how Chris had caught up so easily and noticed he wasn't even sweating. Chris smirked at Loin and teasingly asked if he was already out of breath, saying he guessed Loin was all bark and no bite. He also asked if the clan hadn't fed Loin a bunch of premium potions as a direct heir, which pissed Loin off even more. Chris knew that in an illusory space like this, pushing oneself too hard was pointless. The fools who ran earnestly were only torturing their own bodies. Calmly walking, Chris experienced no stamina drain at all. Just by twisting one spell, he had become invincible in this space. Sebastian noticed his pace and was quietly impressed. Hours later, they arrived at the center of the underground space. 3 of the challengers were panting from exhaustion while Chris remained perfectly relaxed. Alois asked why he was unscathed, and Chris simply replied that it was why he should have trained his body more instead of riding his beast everywhere. Suddenly, a bright diamond appeared and flew past them, welcoming them. It explained that, as they knew, this was the sacred ground, where the purest of pure dark energy bursts forth. They called it the Sacred Darkness. Someone then introduced herself as the manager of the sacred ground, Rihu. She welcomed them once more. Rihu then explained that what they would be doing today was obtaining the Great Pure Darkness, just like the 3rd-ranked Demon King, the Dark Destroyer, and the progenitor of the Dark Magic clan. She then controlled an arrow of light to float in front of each challenger and guided it to pierce the space behind them. She informed them that the darkness was not sufficient for all to share, and the demon beast inside would test their worthiness. The arrows pointed towards separate rooms assigned to each challenger. He raised his hand and asked Rihu if what she was saying was based on who arrived first, to which she replied yes. He then asked what would happen if an unforeseen mishap occurred between competitors during the rite. Would it result in disqualification? Rihu replied that each of them would be on a different path, meaning they shouldn't encounter one another. But on the off chance they did, they were to avoid conflict, as wasting time would only benefit the other competitors. A countdown from 3 began, and all the challengers faced their respective rooms. Rihu told them to focus on their own safety. When the countdown hit 0, they all rushed to their assigned rooms, and Rihu wished them good fortune. Sebastian and Rihu watched in silence. Once all of them had disappeared into their paths, Sebastian asked Rihu if she wanted to bet some blood juice on who would win, but Rihu just left, brushing him off and leaving Sebastian annoyed. Meanwhile, in one of the rooms, Loin was rushing forward when a monster appeared, a 4-eyed wolf imbued with flame magic. It dashed toward him, but Loin didn't stop running. Instead, he gathered dark energy into his hand and delivered a punch to the demon's neck, followed by a strike to the face and then the chin, causing the beast to cough up blood. Loin smirked, knowing the monsters were only low-rank 2 magic creatures, nothing compared to him, an upper 2-star. He was confident that Chris was having a much rougher time, and remembered that, according to the rules, each path was supposed to have the same distance and level of trials. However, he had bribed a mage to alter Chris's path to contain stronger demon beasts. Loin believed Chris would meet a tragic end at the hands of the monsters, and since deaths during the Sacred Dark Rite were overlooked, this place would become Chris's grave. Moments later, Loin finally reached the end of the room and saw the door to the sacred ground. Smiling, he was confident that he would be the first to arrive, just as he expected. But he was startled when Chris casually told him he was late and asked what took him so long. Chris also added that he was about to die of boredom from all the waiting. Loin stammered, asking how Chris had arrived so fast. Chris simply replied, "There wasn't much to it." Loin shouted that it was impossible. His path was supposed to have had much stronger monsters. But then Loin realized what he had said and quickly covered his mouth. It was too late. Chris had already heard. Chris told Loin that it made sense now. He had thought the monsters were stronger than they should have been. Loin demanded to know what he was implying and who he thought he was. Chris replied that it was just the two of them for now, so there was no need for formalities. Loin grew angrier and called him an arrogant asshole. He then unleashed dark energy through his fist and declared that although it was taboo for competitors to clash during the rite, he would crush Chris here and now. Loin launched a punch at Chris, but he easily dodged it. Chris recognized the technique. It was magic combat art, a close-range combat method that exploded magic on impact or disabled an opponent by targeting their joints. Loin continued launching a flurry of punches, but Chris dodged each one effortlessly, barely breaking a sweat. Enraged, Loin attacked with an even greater punch charged with dark energy, but again Chris avoided it with ease. Loin then tried to grab Chris's arm, vowing to break it, but Chris mocked him, called him a dummy, and grabbed Loin's arm first. He twisted Loin's arm behind his back and told him not to cry if it hurt. He then forcefully pulled it, making Loin scream in pain. Hours later, Alois finally arrived and asked if he was too late. But then he gasped in shock when he saw Loin and the other challengers collapsed on the ground around Chris. Alois asked if he had done it, but Chris just called him a slowpoke, and asked if he planned to faint on his own or if Chris should beat him until he passed out. Alois activated his subjugation art technique and shouted that he hadn't just been sitting around doing nothing, and told Chris to come at him. But just one punch later, Alois collapsed to the ground. Chris thought it felt like deja vu and figured they would all be taken away if he left them there. He knew that 5 years from now, the first great war against the Alliance would break out. That meant he had to bring the Dark Magic clan under his control before then, which was why he couldn't afford to share even a single ounce of the sacred darkness with anyone. He approached the sacred gate once he had cleaned up, opened it alone, and stepped forward, knowing it was finally time for him to take possession of the sacred darkness. Sacred darkness was the power that granted a fiend the possibility of becoming a true transcendent. The Elder Clan head, known to have absorbed 80% of the sacred darkness, remained one of the strongest beings alive, even among the demon monarchs. The Dark Destroyer had absorbed more than 90% of the pure dark energy to become a demon king. Chris understood what that meant. If he could make 100% of the pure dark energy his, he could surpass even the Demon Emperor. He stood before the sacred darkness and slowly reached toward it. His hand pierced into the dark mass, and he began to absorb its power. 2 days later, in the waiting room, the guests were in disbelief upon hearing that everyone other than Chris had been eliminated. It was considered a disaster, especially since Loin was in critical condition. A woman questioned whether Chris might have used a trick, a banned magical tool, or something else. A man agreed, suggesting a thorough investigation, but they both fell silent when Jupien interrupted and stated that such measures would not be necessary. In her view, Chris would not be exiting the sacred ground. Jupien believed the fact that Chris hadn't emerged after 2 days could only mean one of two things. Either he was still attempting to absorb the sacred darkness due to its overwhelming volume, or he had already been crushed by it and died. She added that even the Elder Clan head had encountered a limit to how much sacred darkness he could absorb. There was no doubt in her mind that Chris was dead, and not even a corpse would remain. She left the room, vowing that if Chris somehow returned alive, she would kill him herself. As she walked, she recalled how, after her father's death during battle with the Alliance, both she and Loin had been adopted by their uncle, Viscount Langham. Her footing within the clan had always been unstable. And now, with Loin having failed to claim the sacred darkness as well, no one would support him as a successor. She silently vowed to make Chris pay for the humiliation. Elsewhere, a young maid asked if the so-called good-for-nothing still hadn't emerged. An older maid replied that Chris must already be dead and said it was punishment for someone too greedy to understand his place. The two maids pointed at Marie, who stood waiting calmly, and teased that she would soon meet her master's ghost. But their laughter was cut short when the older maid's bag was suddenly struck. Marie, with an eerie calm, warned them that while her heart fluttered in anticipation of her master's return, if they continued being noisy, she would turn them into ghosts under her control. Terrified, the maids fled while screaming that they understood. Once they were gone, Marie looked out the window and quietly pleaded for Chris to return. In her mind, she scolded him, reminding him that a man who made a maiden wait was not cool at all. Meanwhile, deep within the sacred ground, Chris awoke to find himself surrounded by endless darkness. It constricted his breathing, and he estimated he was around the 70% mark. The process was proving far more difficult than expected. He reminded himself that the true trial would begin at 90%. He also knew that absorbing too much could cause his core to shatter, killing him long before the war even began. He remembered one possibility: the dragon heart. Determined, he resumed absorbing darkness, imitating the structure of a dragon's core, known for having the largest container capacity. The dark energy surged into the imitation heart. But then, his core cracked, pain shot through him, and he realized he had reached his limit. He needed to stop. Then, unexpectedly, someone appeared in front of him. A voice asked if he required help. He was stunned to see Mefina, and questioned how a demon had entered that space. But demons, by nature, could communicate with darkness, making it easy for her. Mefina told him that she could help him, and no conditions were required. Confused, he asked why, but she only laughed and said it was simply a fleeting whim. She reached out and ordered him to take her hand and absorb all of the sacred darkness. 1 week later, the Elder Clan head gently placed his golden teacup down, and remarked that it was hard to believe Chris was still alive, given that no news had come for several days. Marion, troubled, thought to herself that such reckless ambition made little sense and wondered why Chris had done it. Simon informed the head clan that Viscount Langham, the acting head, agreed and had expressed the wish to close the pathway to the sacred ground. Simon then asked if the head clan would give the order. The Elder Clan head internally called Langham a wicked brat, suspecting him of trying to test his resolve. He turned to Simon and asked if he truly believed Chris was still alive. Simon replied that the odds were close to zero, but added that Chris was an unusually interesting young master. The Elder Clan head fell silent for a long moment, then made his decision. He told Simon to inform Viscount Langham that the sacred ground would remain open for one more day. Marion exhaled in quiet relief. Simon acknowledged the command and left to carry it out.